History books tell you presidents shape history. But behind the podiums and portraits, they're just eccentric humans with an alarming fondness for cats, custards, and classical piano. This isn't about politics, it's about the strange little ticks that slip through the cracks of greatness. Facts so weird, they make the Constitution look like light reading. So settle in. We're spending the next 25,000 words in the weirdest corner of presidential history. George Washington. George Washington had a habit, not the cherry tree thing, not the dentures, which were mostly ivory, by the way. No, George Washington was chronically, obsessively, existentially punctual, the kind of man who didn't just value time. He considered it a form of moral discipline. Being late? That wasn't rude, it was heresy. He owned multiple pocket watches, all meticulously wound. When guests arrived even 5 minutes late for dinner at Mount Vernon, Washington wouldn't sigh. He wouldn't scold. He would simply begin without them. The sound of silverware scraping porcelain would serve as their punishment. No speeches, no side eyes, just quiet contempt, plated and steaming. But his fixation wasn't merely social. It was military. During the Revolutionary War, his obsession with time became an unspoken doctrine. He'd ride out at absurd hours to inspect troops before dawn, just to make sure the guards weren't sleeping on the job. Spoiler, some were. If an aide arrived late with correspondence, Washington wouldn't yell. He'd stare, quietly. So quietly it made grown men confess sins they hadn't yet committed. And if you think it was just about clocks, think again. Washington believed punctuality revealed your soul. In one letter to Alexander Hamilton, he wrote, "A loss of time is irrevocable. The abuse of time is injurious to the soul." That's not a calendar reminder. That's Calvinist fire and brimstone, delivered with a ticking undertone. Now here's where it gets weird. Some historians argue Washington's punctuality was less about order and more about control. After all, here was a man who could not lie, allegedly, could not smile with ease. His mouth was a dental horror show, and could not tolerate chaos. Time was the one thing he could discipline when men and muskets refused to obey. His schedule was the battlefield he always won. There's even a curious anecdote, apocryphal but poetic, about how, during a foggy morning inspection near Morristown, a watch in his coat pocket stopped ticking. For the next 3 hours, Washington stood perfectly still, refusing to move until the sun hit the horizon and confirmed the time. "The world may break," he reportedly muttered, "but it must not be late." And it wasn't just wartime rigidity. Washington's presidency ran on precision too. Meetings were timed, visits were limited. Even his dog had a feeding schedule you could chart with sundials. When Thomas Jefferson once showed up late for a cabinet meeting, Washington dismissed him after 2 minutes and didn't acknowledge him for the rest of the week. Was he cold? Numbered just, thermally disciplined. Now here's the irony. The man obsessed with the movement of time would die after a brief but oddly mistimed series of medical disasters. In December 1799, he caught a throat infection. Doctors tried leeches, laxatives, and good old-fashioned bleeding. They didn't just drain his blood. They drained it 4 times. He died shortly after at precisely 10:20 p.m., according to the pocket watch held by his secretary. Not a second early, not a second late. The man even timed his exit. And yet, Washington's legacy is filled with frozen symbols, statues, monuments, paintings. He's immortalized not in action, but in pause. Maybe he finally conquered time, not by speeding it up, but by stepping outside it, which raises a question. What happens when the man of clocks meets the man of spirals? Because our next president didn't walk in straight lines. He walked in circles. Deliberately. Let's talk about John Adams. John Adams didn't just pace. He spiraled. In the early mornings, while most of Braintree was still asleep and the chickens were plotting breakfast, Adams would step out into his yard and begin walking in perfectly measured circles. Not meandering, not drifting, circles, over and over, with a gait so focused and repetitive that neighbors began referring to it, less as a ritual and more as a symptom. It wasn't aimless. According to Adams himself, this was meditative locomotion, a way to organize thoughts, wrestle with dilemmas, and prepare for arguments that hadn't yet happened. Picture a 5-foot 7-inch ball of colonial neurosis, walking laps in the grass, murmuring constitutional hypotheticals in Latin, and muttering about monarchy under his breath. To passers-by, it looked like madness, And perhaps it was. But to Adams, it was a moral exercise. This was a man who distrusted stillness. He believed the soul needed agitation the way fire needs oxygen. In one letter, he wrote, "In idleness, there is rot. In motion, there is mind," which sounds philosophical until you realize he was likely referring to his laps around the plum tree. His children would wake to find the yard torn in circular paths. On more than one occasion, Abigail, his sharp, no-nonsense wife, would remind him that the world is not solved by stomping the grass. He disagreed. He once drafted a treaty outline immediately after one of his morning walks. The man circled until diplomacy fell out. Here's the kicker. He sometimes wrote letters about walking in circles. In one missive to Thomas Jefferson, he confessed that walking in loops gave him clarity of the brain and a kind of civilized solitude, though he also admitted parenthetically that it made the neighbors look at me as though I were spectral. This did not bother him. But it wasn't just eccentricity, it was part performance. Adams had a low-key obsession with control. Circular walking became a metaphor for it. A private theater where he could rehearse debates, rationalize bitterness, and burn off what he called the static of democracy. And boy, did he have bitterness. Adams felt perpetually overlooked. His presidency was bookended by Jefferson's charm and Washington's gravitas. He was the middle child of the founding era, the man who signed the Alien and Sedition Acts by day and walked angry loops about it by night. There's an apocryphal account, unverified, deliciously dramatic, of a moment near the end of his presidency. After losing re-election to Jefferson, Adams reportedly walked 37 circles in the snow before coming inside, sitting by the fire and whispering, "Well, at least I thought about it." He also kept a daily journal of weather conditions, as if documenting the physical world would help stabilize the political one. One entry simply read, "Wind cold, snow deep, Constitution shakier than hoped." Now here's the philosophical twist. The man who walked in circles ended up stuck in one, historically. He and Jefferson, once friends turned rivals turned correspondents, died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the declaration they both helped create. Adams' last words, "Thomas Jefferson survives," which was tragically incorrect. Jefferson had died hours earlier. In the end, Adams died misinformed and spinning, metaphorically this time, around the legacy he helped birth but never quite owned. Still, there's a weird peace in the repetition. In circles, there's comfort, a man walking endlessly not to arrive but to think, to forget, to be seen but not understood. And if walking in circles is one kind of obsession, drinking French wine by the barrel is another, because the next president, he didn't just believe wine was healthier than water, he built an entire philosophy around it. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson drank wine like it was a right enshrined in the Constitution, not a luxury, not a guilty pleasure, a foundational necessity for the health of the Republic and for the digestive tract. He didn't just sip it, he imported it by the thousands. Over the course of his life, Jefferson brought in more than 20,000 bottles of French wine to Monticello, cataloged them obsessively, and even kept detailed tasting notes that make modern sommeliers look like children sniffing juice boxes. To Jefferson, wine was civilization in a glass. It was reason, taste, philosophy decanted. He once wrote, "No nation is drunken where wine is cheap," which sounds wise until you realize he was spending more on Bordeaux than most Americans earned in a year. But here's the weirdest part. Jefferson didn't drink wine because he liked getting drunk. In fact, he was borderline puritanical about intoxication. He drank wine the way monks chant, ritually, intellectually, and with a low-key superiority complex. You see, Jefferson believed water, yes, water, was suspect, dangerous, potentially fatal. In fact, much of the 18th century agreed. Water could carry disease. Wine, on the other hand, was fermented and safe. It was the Enlightenment in liquid form, clean, rational, European. Jefferson once remarked that drinking water untamed by nature was a gamble he'd rather not take. A cup of Burgundy? Now that was trustworthy. And this trust turned into obsession. At Monticello, Jefferson built a subterranean wine cellar, carved into the hill itself. It stayed cool year-round. He designed dumbwaiters to carry bottles up from the cellar directly into the dining room, because nothing says democratic virtue like a secret booze elevator. His personal logs note not just varietals and regions, but barrel wood, harvest years, and shipping routes. He corresponded with French vintners the way teenage fans write to K-pop stars, passionately, frequently, and with weirdly specific requests. But here's the kicker. Jefferson couldn't afford it. Not really. He was perpetually in debt. His wine expenses were excessive, even by aristocratic standards. One year, he spent the equivalent of $120,000 in today's money on claret and champagne alone. When his creditors came knocking, he did what any good Enlightenment philosopher would do. He sold some land, ordered more wine, and doubled down. Jefferson's love for wine also had geopolitical ambitions. He hoped Americans would reject hard liquor, what he called the ruin of nations, and embrace wine culture. He saw a vineyard future, rolling hills of Virginia producing a peaceful agrarian society, sipping Chianti and arguing politely about liberty. Spoiler, it didn't catch on. In fact, Jefferson tried planting vineyards at Monticello using imported European vines. They all died, every single one. Turns out Virginia soil, Virginia bugs, and Virginia weather don't care about Enlightenment ideals. But Jefferson, being Jefferson, saw this not as failure, but as potential deferred. The wine would come. One day, America would mature, like a bottle of 1787 Lafite. Speaking of which, that very bottle, a Bordeaux believed to have belonged to Jefferson, would later be auctioned in the 1980s for $156,000. And then, in a poetic twist, it cracked and leaked in its case before anyone could drink it. A Jeffersonian tragedy, aged to perfection. But here's where things go from eccentric to existential. Jefferson's love of wine wasn't just about taste. It was about control. In a world where revolutions exploded and governments collapsed and friends became enemies overnight, wine followed rules. Fermentation, decanting, tannins, time. It was a science, an art, and a metaphor. The more he drank, the more order he imagined. And yet, behind all the civility, all the European imports, and the candlelit tastings was a man who championed liberty while owning over 600 enslaved people. A man who toasted freedom with Bordeaux while others toiled in his vineyard. The contradiction is so thick, you could pair it with a goat cheese and call it an appetizer. In the end, Jefferson didn't die with a wine glass in hand, but close. His debts overwhelmed his estate. Monticello was sold. Bottles were emptied. Dreams of American vineyards vanished into barrels of what-ifs. Still, he left us with a strange legacy, not just as a president, but as a sommelier of political philosophy, a man who believed wine could civilize a republic, even as the republic uncorked its own chaos. And speaking of chaos, what happens when you mix Latin, Hebrew, and a nervous constitution? Because the next president, he made language his wine, and his fellow founding fathers couldn't read the label. James Madison didn't just write the Constitution. He whispered to it in multiple languages, like a man trying to woo a very nervous oracle. Hebrew, Latin, Greek, French. He knew them all. Not conversationally, ritualistically, like spells, like incantations, like someone who believed that government wasn't built with laws, but with syntax. By most accounts, Madison was quiet, awkward, and physically underwhelming. Standing just over 5 feet 4 inches, barely 100 pounds, a pocket-sized president with the linguistic density of a scholarly neutron star. While other founding fathers posed for oil portraits and duels, Madison was hiding in his study, mixing ancient verbs into constitutional theory. He didn't do it to show off. He did it because English was never enough. According to those who worked with him, Madison's personal notes, his real thoughts, were often laced with hybridized sentences, a clause in Latin, a closing in Greek, occasionally even an interjection in Hebrew. Imagine reading a policy draft and halfway through finding "Ica non debet perir." Translation: the republic must not perish. Cool, stirring. Until you realize it's just a margin note in what was supposed to be a military appropriations bill. Even Thomas Jefferson, himself no intellectual lightweight, once joked that Madison's early drafts of the Bill of Rights read like a sermon at Babel. But it wasn't arrogance. It was how his brain worked. Language wasn't just a tool, it was a belief system. He once wrote, "Words are the conductors of the human will. Their clarity is liberty's defense," which is a fancy way of saying, if you can't say it precisely, you can't think it clearly, and you sure as hell can't govern it. His letters reveal a man constantly tweaking phrasing, testing meaning, dissecting even commas for what they implied about power, order, and the soul of the republic. The man didn't just worry about tyranny. He worried about how to phrase a law so tyranny couldn't sneak in through a preposition. And then there was his journal, a private, nearly indecipherable notebook filled with fragments of philosophical debates, all coded in multilingual shorthand. One page, found decades later, reads like this: Hobbes era, voluntas populi superior est legi. KH Buvidi, Habm HVA, MVD 8 Blomvikarti translation. Hobbes was wrong. The will of the people is superior to the law. The dignity of man is the pillar of democracy. Let that sink in. Madison wasn't just arguing with Hobbes. He was correcting him in Latin and Hebrew. But here's the irony. For all his fluency, Madison was terrible at speeches. He spoke in a reedy, trembling voice. Couldn't project. Delegates often leaned in and still missed half of what he said. There's a tragic absurdity to it. The man who architected the American system with surgical linguistic precision couldn't shout over a cough in Congress. He also had migraines, severe ones, often triggered by stress, overstimulation, or, wait for it, prolonged conversations. He once fled a public event early after hearing someone misquote Cicero. That's not diva behavior. That's an allergic reaction to imprecision. And yet, Madison wasn't brittle. He was quietly formidable. Every clause in the Constitution has his fingerprints, words chosen not for flourish, but for indestructibility. It's like watching a man build a spaceship with tweezers. He feared majorities. He feared monarchs. But most of all, he feared imprecision. In one debate, when an opponent tried to simplify a legal clause, Madison snapped, "We do not govern with approximations." That line should be engraved over every congressional door. Instead, it's buried in the notes of a man who barely raised his voice. Even his letters to his wife, Dolly, are curious. Affectionate, yes, but peppered with odd snippets of Latin. One note ends with, "Te amabo in aeternum, I will love you forever." Sure, but did it need to sound like a Roman tombstone? Apparently, yes. Here's the strangest twist. Madison's multilingualism may have helped him hide thoughts even from his peers. He could layer nuance, imply things only certain readers would catch, and revise history in real time. He was a one-man linguistic encryption machine, and still, despite his scholarship, his vision, his near-obsessive clarity, the meaning of his most famous work, the Constitution, remains endlessly debated, misread, mangled, ironically misunderstood. So maybe all that Latin didn't make things clearer. Maybe it just made the fog sound smarter. But Madison wasn't the only one tangled in contradictions, because the next president, he believed in freedom, but couldn't afford his own. James Monroe died broke. Not poetically broke. Not metaphorically broke. We're talking auctioning off the furniture broke. The fifth president of the United States, Revolutionary War veteran, founding father, architect of the Monroe Doctrine, closed out his days not with a triumphant farewell tour, but with creditors at the door and his estate on the auction block. And here's the kicker. It wasn't new. He was already broke when he took office. Imagine interviewing for a job that pays peanuts, already in debt, and thinking, yeah, I could run a continent. That was Monroe. But unlike some of his polished predecessors, Monroe was the least aristocratic of the bunch. He was less powdered wig, more field coat, less salon philosophy, more trench grit. At 18, he dropped out of college to fight in the Revolutionary War, took a musket ball to the shoulder at Trenton, and spent the rest of his life trying to walk upright under the weight of national ideals and compounding interest. See, Monroe had a habit. He believed public service shouldn't come with a price tag. The problem was, it always came with a price tag. And Monroe, he just never paid it. Throughout his long, loyal career, ambassador to France, senator, governor, secretary of state, secretary of war, president, he routinely fronted personal funds for national business. Hotels, carriages, diplomatic dinners. Want to throw a party for French dignitaries? Monroe would foot the bill. Need to impress the British ambassador? He'll buy the wine himself, no reimbursement necessary. Just send the freedom vibes. He kept receipts. So many receipts. Boxes of them. All unclaimed. By the time he left the presidency, he was hemorrhaging money and desperate for Congress to settle his claims. They never fully did. Instead, he retired to his estate in Virginia, only to watch it slowly collapse into debt-ridden decay. That estate, Highland, near Charlottesville, had to be sold, piece by piece. Furniture, land, books. Even his personal sword from the war was liquidated. Imagine auctioning off your own myth. Here's the irony. Monroe's name is attached to one of the most powerful doctrines in American history. The Monroe Doctrine, a defiant message to European powers to keep their grubby hands off the Western Hemisphere. It was bold. It was global. It was geopolitics with a punch, and it was delivered by a man who couldn't afford to replace the shutters on his house. He lived his final years shuttling between relatives' homes, like a war hero couch surfing in a land he helped create. Eventually, he moved in with his daughter in New York. Even there, he wrote humble letters asking for small loans, seeking reimbursement for things he'd paid for decades earlier. Things like quills, postage, and meals for government officials long dead. When he died on July 4th, 1831, yes, another founding father who died on Independence Day, there wasn't even enough in his estate to fund a proper burial. He was interred in New York, far from Virginia soil, until the Commonwealth of Virginia relocated his remains decades later as a posthumous apology wrapped in ceremony. But here's what's truly strange. Monroe never complained. Not publicly, not bitterly. His letters show a kind of quiet, relentless idealism. He believed, truly believed, that the Republic would do the right thing, that public service was sacred, that sacrifice was not just expected, but required. And maybe that's what made him weird. Not the debts, not the doctrine, but the faith. In an era of rising cynicism, Monroe remained stubbornly earnest. A man who walked through empires, toppled kings, navigated revolutions, and still thought someone might eventually pay him back for the hotel bill in Paris. Spoiler, they didn't. So we're left with a paradox. The president who warned Europe to stay out of the Americas couldn't even afford to stay in his own home. He made America bigger, while becoming smaller in history's rearview mirror. And yet, perhaps that's the final echo of his legacy, a quiet reminder that not all revolutionaries get a statue. Some get receipts. Now, speaking of receipts, what if your campaign speech was so pretentious you had to translate it just so Americans could understand it? John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams didn't campaign. He sermonized. He didn't pitch to voters. He translated his thoughts down into English, like a philosopher reluctantly descending from Olympus to address the mortals. And no, that's not a metaphor. He literally wrote his own campaign speeches in Latin and then translated them into English. Why? Because Latin, he believed, preserved the elevated tone of thought. Because English, poor squishy English, was too messy, too emotional, too vulnerable to corruption and slang. To Adams, Latin was clean, precise, eternal, perfect for public virtue and also, apparently, electoral messaging. So while his rivals were shaking hands and kissing babies, Adams was conjugating verbs and polishing prose like he was running for consul of the Republic of Rome. The irony, he wasn't even running in a modern sense. In the election of 1824, Adams didn't campaign at all. It was considered beneath the dignity of a gentleman. Still, he wrote out speeches as if he might be called upon to lead, like an oracular librarian reluctantly dragged from his scrolls. And the speeches? Pure philosophy, dense, ponderous, structured like Roman legal treatises. One of his early campaign pamphlets opens with Libertem non in clamoribus, sed in legibus invenimus, which means we find liberty not in shouting, but in law. Okay, sure. Great quote. But imagine being a Pennsylvania farmer handed that as campaign material. He just wanted to know if you'd fix the canal. Now he's being asked to parse Cicero. But this was the paradox of John Quincy Adams. Intellectually brilliant, socially allergic. He was the son of a president, but acted more like a professorial ghost, haunting the corridors of power. He kept daily diaries his entire life, nearly 15,000 pages worth. In them he judged everyone. He criticized Jefferson for being too casual, Monroe for being too eager, Jackson for being Jackson. He once wrote that the mob is to be feared as much in republics as in monarchies, which is an elite way of saying, I don't trust voters. And yet, Adams was a true believer in the republic. He just didn't trust it to like him. His presidency was awkward. He was cold, formal, and brilliant in ways that didn't matter to the average voter. He proposed a national university, astronomical observatories, and a network of scientific expeditions. Congress looked at him like he'd proposed alchemy. They wanted roads, he wanted telescopes, they wanted tariffs, he wanted metaphysics. His speeches, when he gave them, were long, not Lincoln long, Sistine Chapel long. He quoted Ovid and Euripides. He once began a cabinet meeting with a reading from Seneca. That's not governance. That's a literary hostage situation. But here's the kicker. Adams didn't get interesting until after he left the presidency. He went back to Congress. Yes, a former president demoted to representative and became a human fireball. He railed against slavery with the kind of fury usually reserved for revolutionaries and failing weather prophets. When Southern legislators tried to silence abolitionist petitions, Adams brought them up anyway, dozens a day. He was relentless. He was called the old man eloquent, which in political language means that guy who ruins every lunch. And yet, he made a difference. His intellect, so alienating in politics, became weaponized in the right fight. One colleague wrote, "He debates like a lawyer possessed by the ghosts of dead philosophers." He meant it as a compliment. Sort of. Then one day, at age 80, mid-debate on the House floor, Adams collapsed. He died 2 days later in the Speaker's chamber, like he'd refused to leave the arena even as his body gave out. But here's what lingers. Adams lived in translation. Not just linguistically, but morally. His thoughts had to be decoded. His ideals filtered. His speeches softened. He was always trying to make virtue legible to a public that mostly wanted simpler stories. And now, he's remembered mostly as the guy between Monroe and Jackson, a punctuation mark in the textbook, a transitional president, which is a shame because his life reads like an opera if the libretto were written in Latin and footnoted twice. Still, there's something noble in the futility of it. A man so committed to integrity, he became unintelligible, the Latin candidate, the anti-Jackson. And speaking of Jackson, what happens when a man thinks so differently from Adams that he skips the Latin, skips the diplomacy, and threatens to hang his own vice president? Because that's where we're going next. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson didn't believe in subtlety. He believed in bullets, banknotes, and bare-knuckle threats. If John Quincy Adams was Latin footnotes, Jackson was a boot print. And once, famously not metaphorically, he threatened to hang his own vice president. Let's set the scene. It was 1832, during the crescendo of the nullification crisis, a constitutional meltdown disguised as a tariff dispute. South Carolina, led by Jackson's own vice president, John C. Calhoun, decided that federal laws could be nullified within state borders. It was like a state giving the federal government the middle finger while waving a "don't tread on me" flag in the other hand. Jackson, a former general, didn't do middle fingers. He did gallows. At a public dinner meant to promote compromise and reconciliation, Jackson stood, glass in hand, and issued one of the coldest toasts in American history: our federal union. It must be preserved. Calhoun stood immediately after and responded, "The union, next to our liberty, most dear." That's not just political tension. That's two men preparing to duel with dinnerware. Behind the scenes, things got worse. Letters were leaked. Positions hardened. South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification. Jackson, in response, drafted a force bill, giving him authority to use military action against American citizens. And then he said, privately, but with just enough witnesses to be dangerous, "If one drop of blood be shed in defiance of the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man of them I can get my hands on, from the first tree I can find." The first man was very clearly Calhoun, his own vice president. Jackson didn't technically mean he'd tie a rope himself, but given his history, no one was entirely sure. This was the man who fought 103 duels or near duels in his lifetime. He once killed a man over a card game insult. He lived with a bullet in his lung for decades because the doctor couldn't safely remove it. His internal organs were less healthy tissue and more metallic archive. Threatening to hang Calhoun wasn't even the craziest part of his week. This was a man whose pet parrot had to be removed from his funeral for swearing too much. A man who beat an assassin with his cane after the man's pistol misfired twice. A man who was so feared that opponents said his body hissed with revenge like a furnace, which is either biblical or heavy metal depending on your point of reference. But back to Calhoun. The relationship had been souring for years. Political differences, personal contempt. Calhoun wanted to preserve states' rights. Jackson wanted to preserve Jackson. Calhoun was academic, cold, scheming. Jackson was kinetic, emotional, vindictive. They didn't clash, they collided. Eventually, the situation cooled when South Carolina backed down and accepted a compromise tariff, but Calhoun resigned shortly after, becoming the first VP in history to quit midterm, probably out of self-preservation. It's hard to focus on policy when you're worried about rope and tree proximity. And yet this episode, while terrifying, was peak Jackson. He believed in the indivisibility of the Union with the same spiritual fervor that others reserved for Scripture. He saw disobedience not as disagreement, but treason. He didn't just want compliance. He wanted submission, not out of tyranny, but out of a deep, primal belief that the country must move as one body, his body. You weren't negotiating with Jackson, you were surviving him. And here's the twist. He was wildly popular. The public loved the drama, the violence, the threats. Jackson wasn't a leader in the classical sense. He was a force of nature people voted for. He didn't wear the presidency, he devoured it. But there's a quieter paradox here. Jackson, the man so obsessed with national unity that he threatened his own VP with death, also enabled policies like the Indian Removal Act that permanently fractured the moral foundations of the country. The man who saved the Union nearly tore it apart with cruelty, a tree for every traitor, a trail for every displaced tribe. He couldn't see the contradiction, or maybe he did, and considered it acceptable collateral. Still, he set a precedent. The president as brawler. No powdered wigs, no Latin translations, just the Constitution and a club. And yet, what happens when the next president steps into Jackson's South and refuses to hunt? Because our next story is about a man who walked through the land of rifles and refused to fire a single shot. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren entered the American South with two things: a velvet waistcoat and an unwavering refusal to shoot anything. Not birds, not deer, not even squirrels, which, in 19th century plantation country, was like declaring war on masculinity itself. While his predecessors carved the Republic with rifles and saber duels, Van Buren strolled through it like a man inspecting the wallpaper of a very large, violent mansion. And when the plantation elite, those southern titans of tobacco, bourbon, and ritualized blood sport, invited him on their sacred morning hunts, Van Buren politely declined. Repeatedly, he would smile, tip his hat, and say something evasive like, "I find no satisfaction in death by sport," which is a dignified way of saying, "You enjoy killing things. I'll be sipping tea." It was a quiet scandal. Hunting wasn't just recreation in the antebellum South. It was theology. It was how men proved their worth, bonded with their peers, and showed nature who was boss. Van Buren's refusal wasn't read as pacifism. It was seen as effeminacy, weakness, worse, Yankee moralism. He didn't flinch. Van Buren, the son of a tavern keeper from Kinderhook, New York, was made of slipperier stuff. They called him the Little Magician, not because he cast spells, though some might argue his political evasions qualified, but because he could disappear inside a sentence. He was smooth, controlled, always present, but impossible to pin down. He wore impeccable suits, carried snuff, spoke softly, and didn't care if your dogs bayed at dawn. Even as president, he was meticulous in presentation. Every hair in place, every reply carefully framed, and when plantation owners muttered about manliness, Van Buren offered them formal dinner menus, constitutionally lawful vetoes, and the occasional cold, intellectual smile. But his non-hunting wasn't an accident. It was part of a pattern. Van Buren was a minimalist with violence. He believed in persuasion, not force. His political machine in New York, the Albany Regency, was built on compromise, backroom deals, and handwritten charm. Bullets? That was Jackson's style. Van Buren preferred letters sealed with wax. Here's the irony. While he refused to hunt animals, his political career was built on ruthless maneuvering. He helped engineer Andrew Jackson's rise. He smoothed the chaos, quieted the fires, became vice president, then president, all without ever firing a gun. He didn't need one, and yet his southern tour became a problem. Word spread. He doesn't shoot. He declined the hound. He doesn't even own a rifle. These weren't whispers. They were warnings. To a region obsessed with power through dominance, Van Buren looked like an herbivore who'd somehow wandered into a barbecue. One planner reportedly referred to him as a fancy woman in trousers, which, in 1830s terms, was the diplomatic equivalent of a headbutt. Another said he walks among us as if judging us. And honestly, he kind of was. Van Buren never corrected them. He didn't care to, because beneath the polished exterior was a man who viewed the South's rituals not just as strange, but archaic. He didn't need to say it out loud. He implied it. With every refused invitation, every day spent reading instead of shooting, every soft no was a moral sledgehammer wrapped in satin gloves. But here's the twist. Van Buren's restraint wasn't rewarded. The economy tanked during his presidency. The Panic of 1837 annihilated public trust. His opponents painted him as aloof, out of touch, and, most damaging of all, not manly enough to fix it. The irony? It wasn't his fault. The economic collapse was a long fuse lit before he ever entered office. But nuance doesn't vote. He lost re-election badly, and yet he walked away without ever compromising that strange moral reflex. He never shot a thing, not once. And in that way, he remains a historical anomaly, a 19th century politician who said no to blood, despite every cultural pressure to say yes. His portrait still hangs in the White House. Perfect posture, perfect curls, and not a trace of gunpowder on his hands. But speaking of people with powder on their hands, what happens when the next president does love hunting, just in the historical sense, and decides to style his entire life after ancient Roman generals? Because the next man on our list, he didn't just read Latin, he signed letters in it. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison spent more time quoting dead Roman generals than he did being president, which is almost statistically true. He served only 31 days in office, but in that short span he managed to live out a full classical fantasy, the statesman-farmer-soldier archetype, dripping with Latin, bathed in glory, and ultimately soaked to the bone in cold rain. Because Harrison didn't just admire ancient Rome, he styled himself after it. Seriously, he signed letters in Latin, referred to political opponents as tribunes, called Congress a modern Senate, even described the presidency once as a form of civic burden bestowed upon a reluctant patriot. That's not rhetoric, that's cosplay. But it gets weirder. When preparing for his inauguration, Harrison, aged 68, frail, and already coughing, insisted on delivering the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, over 8,000 words, in the dead of winter, with no coat, no hat, and certainly no sense of meteorology. Why? Because Cincinnatus wouldn't have worn a coat. To Harrison, the Roman ideal wasn't a costume. It was a moral blueprint. He genuinely believed that the strength of a republic rested in the virtue of its leaders, and that virtue meant humility, sacrifice, and an indifference to personal comfort. So when someone suggested he might shorten his speech, or maybe wear a scarf, he refused, because in his mind, if you want to channel Rome, you suffer like Rome. So he stood there, shivering, sermonizing about the dangers of executive power. He compared America's struggles to those of the Roman Republic, warned against Caesarism, invoked ancient virtue, and quoted Marcus Aurelius for a crowd that was really just waiting for the parade. People stopped listening after the first 15 minutes. Harrison kept going for nearly 2 hours, in the cold, bareheaded, because no enemy could match the fury of a Roman metaphor. And then, within weeks, he was dead. The official story, pneumonia, possibly worsened by exposure, though some historians suspect it may have been sepsis from the White House's notoriously grim water supply. Either way, he died faster than any president in history. The man who quoted Cicero didn't even survive the winter, But what's stranger is how Harrison got there in the first place. He wasn't just a war hero, he was a manufactured war hero. The Battle of Tippecanoe, his biggest claim to fame, was a brutal skirmish against indigenous forces led by the Shawnee Prophet, Tenskwatawa. Harrison's forces torched a settlement and declared victory, despite nearly being overrun in the night. The whole event was later repackaged into campaign propaganda as Tippecanoe and Tyler too, transforming Harrison into a rugged frontiersman, even though he lived in a mansion and drank from crystal. But nobody cared about the facts. They cared that he looked like a hero, sounded like a Roman, promised a return to virtue, and drank hard cider. Another myth, carefully crafted to make him seem like a man of the people. Spoiler, he preferred imported wines. His entire candidacy was built on the contradiction between appearance and reality, between Cincinnatus and consumer branding, between Latin maxims and pneumonia bacteria. But here's the wildest irony of all. His death made the presidency stronger. Why? Because his sudden departure forced the first ever presidential succession crisis. The Constitution was unclear about what happened when a president died. Vice President John Tyler took over, but many in Congress argued he was only acting president. Tyler disagreed. He moved into the White House, took the oath, refused to leave, and set the precedent. If the president dies, the VP becomes the president. Full stop. No debates. That doctrine, it was written in Harrison's absence. So, in a strange, almost Roman twist of fate, the man who obsessed over Republican order helped define it by dying. His entire presidency was one long philosophical setup for a punchline written by bacteria, a man who imagined himself a modern Cincinnatus and got taken down by weather, germs, and a really bad speech time slot. But if Harrison lived in the past, his successor lived in fear, because the next president, he wouldn't sit at a table with 13 people, and if he saw a black cat, he changed his route, even if it meant turning the carriage around. John Tyler. John Tyler was not a man guided by policy. He was guided by omens. The 10th president of the United States lived like every day was Friday the 13th, and the federal government was being run by a coven of colonial ghosts. His presidency is most remembered for its constitutional implications, but behind the legal battles and annexation debates was a man who would refuse to sit at a table with 13 people and reroute entire carriages to avoid crossing a black cat's path. Not once. Routinely. He wasn't joking. He didn't chuckle and say, "Oh, better safe than sorry." He just straight up believed. And if you think being president would change that, you don't understand Tyler. Tyler didn't adjust to the presidency. The presidency had to adjust to him. He once delayed a White House dinner because the final RSVP count reached 13. Instead of removing a guest, he added a random junior staffer to even things out. Problem solved. Curse avoided. And when one senator teased him about it, Tyler replied, "I would sooner test the Constitution than tempt the fates," which sounds poetic until you realize he meant literally. There's also the case of the cat detour. While on a trip through rural Virginia, Tyler's carriage driver halted because a black cat had just crossed the road. Tyler ordered the route changed. The road was perfectly clear. The detour added an hour. He took it anyway. One aide noted in his journal, "The president sat in silence, eyes fixed on the trees, as though waiting for the shadow of doom to pass." And don't even get him started on ladders. White House staffers were forbidden from leaving them propped up. On one occasion, a crew repainting the East Room left a ladder leaning against the wall overnight. Tyler noticed it during a late-night walk, refused to pass beneath it, and ordered it taken down before proceeding. He told his valet, no republic should tempt collapse so brazenly. Again, poetic. Again, not a metaphor. But behind the superstition was a man who probably should have worried less about black cats and more about the legitimacy of his own presidency. See, John Tyler was never elected president. He was vice president under William Henry Harrison. And when Harrison died just 31 days into his term, Tyler suddenly found himself at the helm of the government with no clear constitutional precedent. People called him His Accidency, not affectionately. Many in Congress believed he was merely acting president. Tyler disagreed. He moved into the White House, took the oath, and vetoed legislation with full executive swagger. When Congress pushed back, Tyler vetoed them harder. At one point, his entire cabinet, except one, resigned in protest. The Whig Party kicked him out. his own party, and yet, despite being politically orphaned and widely ridiculed, he stayed, clinging to power like it had a gravitational pull, superstitious about symbols, but oddly fearless about scandal. He governed like a man playing chess in the dark, half believing the pieces could curse him if he moved wrong. One aide described his administration as operatic in caution, operatic in loneliness. Another said, the president trusted signs more than advisors, which, to be fair, may still apply to some modern leaders. And here's the final twist. When the Civil War broke out, Tyler sided with the Confederacy. He was elected to the Confederate Congress, dying before he could serve. At his funeral, no American flags were flown. He remains the only U.S. president buried under a foreign banner. In the end, the omens were real. The shadows were following him, just not the feline kind. His legacy is a blur, a constitutional footnote, a president in name but not in spirit. Superstitious, isolated, and ultimately exiled from both parties, both governments, and both sides of history. But while Tyler was seeing ghosts in every mirror, the next president, he was terrified of light bulbs, literally, because James K. Polk believed electric lighting was unnatural, and he preferred to govern by candlelight. James K. Polk. James K. Polk was afraid of light. Not the metaphysical kind, though frankly he gave off enough ghost energy to be considered a spectral candidate, but actual physical light, specifically electric light. To Polk, gas lamps were suspicious, and electric bulbs, practically witchcraft. He preferred candles. Always candles. As president, he insisted the White House remain lit primarily by them, even when newer, brighter, more convenient options were available, not because he was old-fashioned, not because of budget cuts, but because he believed artificial light was unnatural, a violation of order, a trick played on the rhythm of God. One staffer reported that Polk called electric lighting a mechanical sunrise and said it cheats the eyes and confuses the soul, which is a poetic way of saying, I will not be ruled by a filament. And he meant it. Visitors to the White House during Polk's term described the interior as gloomy, monastic, and eerily silent at night, except for the flicker of wax. Ambassadors held meetings under dim chandeliers. Maps were read in shadows. Important documents were signed in a room that looked like it was being haunted by the ghost of legislation passed. He wasn't trying to make a point. He just couldn't trust a light he couldn't understand. But here's the weird part. Polk was a modernizer. He expanded American territory more than almost any other president, adding Texas, Oregon, California, and the entire Southwest. His administration oversaw the creation of the Naval Academy, the Department of the Interior, and the Smithsonian Institution. He was the future's project manager, just not in his living room. He governed like a steam engine, but lived like a flickering monk. It's like Elon Musk refusing to use a microwave because it disrupts the sacred order of thermodynamics. And there's more. Polk was a control freak. He didn't just dislike electric light. He disliked anything that suggested change without his approval. He worked longer hours than most of his predecessors, micromanaged his cabinet, and kept a detailed diary that reads like the journal of a man trying to out-negotiate time itself. He set goals: acquire the West, lower tariffs, settle the Oregon border, and establish an independent treasury. And he did them all in just one term. Then he left. That's right. He ran for one term on purpose, set his goals, ticked the boxes, and walked out. It's the most type A presidency in American history. If Polk had a motto, it would have been, conquer now, burn out later, and he did. He left office utterly spent, physically broken, emotionally hollow. He died 3 months later. That's not retirement. That's an expiration date. Some historians blame cholera. Others say he simply worked himself to death. But maybe, just maybe, the candle went out, literally and symbolically, because Polk didn't just fear electricity. He feared what it represented: disruption, illumination, change without permission. And in that way, he wasn't just afraid of bulbs. He was afraid of what happens when the world moves on before you're ready. Still, there's something unsettling about a man who expanded the borders of an empire by day and insisted on working by candlelight at night, who dragged the map forward but left the chandelier behind. But if Polk feared brightness, the next man embraced fever like it was a battle medal. He didn't fear death. He just fought it on horseback, with dysentery, and a 103-degree fever. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor once fought a battle while actively dying. Not symbolically, not under pressure. Actively dying. He had dysentery, a fever of 103 degrees, and a body leaking more fluids than a broken water pump, and he refused to get off his horse. That's not toughness. That's pure, unfiltered, Old Testament spite. Before he was president, Taylor was a general, the kind you read about in brutal footnotes, sun-baked, mud-streaked, covered in the dust of places like Palo Alto and Buena Vista, known to troops as Old Rough and Ready, which, let's be honest, sounds more like a dive bar than a military hero, but the nickname stuck because it fit. Taylor didn't dress the part of a general. His uniforms were often half-buttoned, his boots scuffed, his horse exhausted. He looked like a man who'd wandered out of a Civil War reenactment with no understanding of irony, and in that mess of sweat and blood and military indifference, he became a legend. But that day, the battle with dysentery is still the strangest. He was in the thick of the Mexican-American War. Hot climate, bad water, long marches. Taylor, already not a fan of doctors, caught dysentery and spiked a sky-high fever. His aides told him to dismount. Rest. Sleep. Maybe try not to explode his internal organs on the battlefield. He said no. Instead, he tied himself upright in the saddle with the help of his staff. He sat there, barely conscious, swaying in the heat like a damp scarecrow, while issuing commands, nodding grimly, and pretending that death wasn't actively tapping him on the shoulder with a clipboard. His troops couldn't believe it, nor could his enemies. It worked. He survived. Barely. Whether the battle turned because of strategy or because both sides were too horrified to shoot at the dying man duct taped to a horse, we'll never know. But Taylor's stubbornness didn't end with war. When he became president, somehow despite never having voted in his life prior to running, he brought that same stand tall, fall apart later philosophy to Washington. He wasn't ideological. He didn't care for speeches. He distrusted banks, parties, and just about anything involving indoor clothing. He once refused to be sworn in on a Sunday, causing a 24-hour constitutional panic where technically no one was president, just vibes. And when it came to the most volatile issue of the day, slavery's expansion, Taylor, a slaveholder himself, took a weirdly moderate position. He believed the Union must be preserved, not through compromise, not through appeasement, but by force if necessary. In fact, when Southern states began muttering about secession, Taylor had a message for them. I would hang them with less reluctance than I hanged deserters and spies in Mexico. Let that marinate. The President of the United States openly threatened hanging Southern leaders if they tried to leave. From a guy with dysentery, that's commitment. But then came the cherries. Yes, cherries. On July 4th, 1850, at a celebration on the White House lawn, Taylor ate a large bowl of cherries and washed it down with iced milk. A few hours later, he was violently ill, stomach cramps, fever, vomiting. Within 5 days, he was dead. The official diagnosis? Gastroenteritis. The likely culprit? Bad cherries, dirty milk, and a lifetime of treating his internal organs like trench fortifications. Conspiracy theories flew. Some claimed he was poisoned, perhaps for opposing slavery's expansion. Over a century later, they exhumed his body, tested the hair. No arsenic, just a dead president and some very traumatized forensic pathologists. But here's the irony. Taylor survived dysentery on a battlefield, survived heat, bullets, political landmines, but it was dessert that did him in. A bowl of fruit, that's Old Testament irony. That's Shakespearean collapse. That's a presidential punchline no one saw coming. Still, his legacy isn't a policy. It's a posture. Zachary Taylor refused to lay down even when his body begged for it. He governed like he fought. Upright, defiant, sweaty. He wasn't eloquent. He wasn't refined, but he had one rule. Never die sitting. And yet, the next president, he filled his house with Egyptian relics he didn't understand. He wanted history, mystery, and imported meaning, but no one knew what he was really trying to say. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore's house was full of Egyptian artifacts. Actual ones. Statues, scarabs, fragments of hieroglyphs, all displayed like treasures from a tomb. except the tomb was a modest house in Buffalo, New York, and the pharaoh wore starched collars and furrowed brows. The weird part? He couldn't explain any of it. No formal study, no deep understanding, no spiritual connection. When guests asked, "Why Egypt?" Fillmore would shrug and say something vague like, "There is wisdom in what endures," which, let's be honest, is the kind of answer you give when you bought a Sphinx sculpture and are now realizing you have no follow-up. But that was Millard Fillmore in a nutshell. Vague, ornamental, a little bit haunted. He wasn't a mystic. He wasn't an archaeologist. He was curious. Painfully so. The kind of man who read encyclopedia entries out loud for a dinner conversation, and once described hieroglyphic as letters frozen in ceremony, which sounds beautiful until you realize he couldn't read a single one. Still, his obsession ran deep. Fillmore reportedly had entire evenings where he'd just pace his parlor, staring at these ancient objects like they were going to speak to him. He once hosted a visiting diplomat from the Ottoman Empire and insisted on showing him a broken Ankh pendant he'd acquired, asking if it might be a symbol of divine symmetry. The diplomat, very politely, told him it was upside down. But let's back up. Fillmore wasn't born into mystery. He was born into poverty, a log cabin origin story so textbook it makes Lincoln's look middle class. He clawed his way up, self-educated, apprenticed to a cloth maker, read law by candlelight, and became president through sheer administrative competence. He was America's backup quarterback, the man you call when the party implodes, and you just need someone to sign things with clean handwriting. He became president in 1850 after Zachary Taylor's unfortunate death by Cherry, and while Taylor was all grit and heat, Fillmore was cool, reserved, and slightly confused about where all the pyramids went. Politically, he's remembered mostly for signing the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to return escaped enslaved people to their enslavers, even in free states. It was a compromise, he claimed, a gesture toward preserving the Union, but it aged like an unwrapped mummy. And maybe that's why the Egyptian artifacts mattered to him. Maybe they weren't just decorations. Maybe they were symbols of lost empires, of silence after greatness, of what happens when a society forgets how to hold itself together. Or maybe he just liked weird stuff. Let's be honest, the 1850s were peak Egyptomania in the Western world. Obelisks were trendy. Pharaohs were fashion statements. Queen Victoria had a whole wing of her palace designed in faux Theban style. Fillmore may have simply jumped on the sarcophagus bandwagon without realizing he'd boarded a ship of the damned. Still, it's hard to ignore the symbolism. Fillmore, surrounded by relics of ancient collapse, overseeing a country inching toward its own unraveling. He wore gloves, kept his hair perfect, maintained decorum in every photo, and silently watched the cracks appear in the Republic's foundation, like a priest dusting off tombs while the walls trembled. He didn't understand the objects in his home, and he didn't fully grasp the forces pulling his country apart. After leaving office, he returned to Buffalo, where he kept to himself. He didn't write memoirs, didn't chase legacy, just hosted guests, wandered his library, and occasionally gazed at his collection like he was waiting for the stones to whisper advice. They never did, and so he remains. A man of clean gloves and moral ambiguity, a bureaucrat buried in symbols he couldn't read, a president who preserved everything except his own purpose. But if Fillmore collected the symbols of dead civilizations, the next president, no one even showed up to his funeral. No mourning, no procession, just silence. Franklin Pierce had a funeral. Nobody came. Well, someone came. A few distant mourners, a clergyman with a thin voice and a lot of vacant seats. But no sitting politicians. No national mourning. No moment of silence in Congress. No great orations. No flag-draped ceremonies. Just a quiet burial in a damp New Hampshire graveyard, while the rest of the country pretended not to notice. The 14th president of the United States died in silence, which frankly is how he governed. Pierce wasn't obscure because he lacked accomplishments. He was obscure because he tried to disappear while still in office. His presidency is like a locked drawer in a historical filing cabinet, technically there but rarely opened. And yet, there's something morbidly fascinating about Pierce, something uncanny. A man born with charisma, cursed with tragedy, and swallowed by decisions that aged into national shame. Let's start with the grief. Before he took office, Pierce and his wife Jane boarded a train with their last surviving son, 11-year-old Benny. Moments after the train left the station, it derailed. The car was torn open, passengers thrown. Benny was decapitated in front of them. Pierce never recovered. Neither did Jane. She took it as a divine punishment. God did not want Franklin to be president. She wore mourning black the entire time he served. She called the White House a house of sorrow. Pierce governed through a fog of guilt, depression, and cold New England wind. And the country? It barely noticed he was there. He rarely gave speeches. He rarely led. And when he did act, it was often in the wrong direction. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively undid the Missouri Compromise and allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The result? Bleeding Kansas, a series of violent clashes that previewed the Civil War like a national trailer for doom. Pierce thought he was diffusing tensions. He was, in fact, handing out lit matches in a forest of dry leaves. When his party refused to renominate him in 1856, an extremely rare rejection for a sitting president, Pierce reportedly said, "There's nothing left to do but get drunk." He wasn't joking. Alcohol had been his companion for years, and in retirement, it became something closer to religion. And that's where the weird part starts. Because as much as Pierce faded from the public eye, he became strangely visible in private spaces. He was spotted walking in graveyards, visiting old battlefields, sitting in pews during empty church services, always in black, always alone, like he was haunting himself, like he'd become a ghost trying to catch up with his body. He corresponded with old friends, but most abandoned him. He supported the South in the early days of the Civil War, or at least didn't oppose them vocally enough. This ensured his final drift from national memory. By the time he died in 1869, he was a footnote nobody wanted to read. And when the funeral came, no flags lowered, no bell tolled, no honor guard, not even a token wreath from the White House. The government had simply moved on. His name wasn't spoken. His portrait was not dusted. He was buried, not remembered. But here's the mystery. How does a president disappear while still alive? How does a man once seen as charming, brilliant, and full of promise end up alone in a parlor with his coat still on, staring out the window as if waiting for a country that stopped knocking? Pierce didn't just lose the public, he lost the plot, and maybe he knew it. Maybe that's why he let himself go. Maybe that's why the only thing louder than his policies was the silence after they passed. Maybe that's why no one came to the funeral. Because what do you say about a man who tried to erase himself? Except, of course, when he sang. Yes, sang. Not in joy, not at parties. The next president, he burst into song at awkward moments. Alone, on walks, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes mid-argument. Because James Buchanan didn't need an audience. He was the audience. James Buchanan. James Buchanan was a one-man musical. Not metaphorically, not nostalgically, literally. He would burst into song at random, while walking alone, writing letters, or even mid-conversation. Sometimes old folk ballads, sometimes nonsense verses, sometimes entire hymns in oddly timed falsetto. It was less performance and more leakage. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because his mind had no off switch. Conversations were theater. Loneliness was a duet. Constitutional crisis, time for a little warble. Historians like to talk about Buchanan's political failures, and there are many. He's frequently ranked as one of the worst U.S. presidents, mostly because he stood idly by while the Union burned in slow motion. But what they often skip is the haunting fact that Buchanan seemed vaguely aware of his own failure and responded by humming to himself like a man going mad in a well-lit cage. He was the last president before the Civil War. He knew exactly what was happening. He saw the country fracturing, state by state, principle by principle, and his grand plan was basically, if I don't move, maybe it'll all go away. He called slavery a matter for the courts, called secession illegal, but not actionable. He told Congress he had no power to stop Southern states from leaving the Union, and then, in one of history's most poetic shrugs, he didn't. But let's get back to the weirdness. Visitors to the White House often reported hearing Buchanan's voice echoing through the halls, alone, in an upper corridor, mumbling or singing. Aides described him singing to documents, to himself. to the fireplace. He had no sense of timing, no melody, just the bizarre, compulsive need to fill silence with something. One staffer wrote, "The president does sing, but never to anyone." Another said, "His voice had the quality of a man narrating his own downfall." That's not a burn, that's a eulogy. And he was always talking to himself. In meetings, in hallways, while walking the grounds, he'd mutter legal phrases under his breath, like he was trying to argue with invisible justices inside his head. One senator called it a running commentary on events he could no longer control. It wasn't senility, it was disassociation, because Buchanan wasn't a fool. He was deeply educated, sharp even. He served as a senator, diplomat, secretary of state. He knew law, knew government, but by the time he reached the presidency, he had transformed into something else. A man haunted by the precise knowledge that he was not equal to the moment. So he sang, maybe to drown it out, maybe to give his own thoughts a soundtrack. There's also the matter of his bachelorhood, the only lifelong, unmarried U.S. president. He lived with another man, William Rufus King, for many years, and their relationship sparked endless rumors in D.C. circles. Andrew Jackson allegedly called them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. The press mocked him. He never responded, never clarified, just kept singing in corridors while the nation fell apart. By the end of his term, southern states were seceding. Armories were being seized. Militias were drilling. And Buchanan? He was still trying to write polite letters to governors and insist, in increasingly irrelevant tones, that everything could be solved with process and decorum. Spoiler, it couldn't. By the time he handed off power to Abraham Lincoln, the country was already halfway out the door. Buchanan retreated to Pennsylvania, where he spent the rest of his life defending himself in writing and, yes, still reportedly talking aloud to his garden. Some say he sang there too, among the hedges. A man who couldn't stop replaying the overture to his own undoing. And if Pierce was forgotten, Buchanan was remembered all too well as the man who hummed while Rome caught fire. But the next president, he didn't sing. He signed. And when his hands shook too much, he used the left one because he believed the dominant hand carried the weight of fate. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln believed in handwriting, not just penmanship, not just the calligraphic dignity of presidential correspondence. Handwriting to Lincoln was an omen, a signal, a kind of metaphysical thermometer for the state of his soul, and by extension, the soul of the Union. And on his bad days, Lincoln signed official documents with his left hand. Why? Because he believed that the right hand, his dominant one, was bound to fate, to clarity, to destiny, and if it trembled, it meant something was wrong, something cosmic. If his signature faltered under the right hand, it could curse the outcome, so he'd switch. There are multiple letters, pardons, military commissions, and memoranda from Lincoln's presidency signed with a slanted, fragile, left-handed scrawl, each one a kind of whispered prayer to the unknowable machinery of history. His aides noticed. He never commented. He just did it, quietly, like someone negotiating terms with fate. This wasn't superstition. Not exactly. Lincoln didn't believe in ghosts or hexes or seance cabinets like some of his spiritualist contemporaries, but he believed in signs. He believed in dreams, in intuition, in the subtle tremors of the subconscious as a form of prophecy. He once told a colleague that he had a dream of a ship sailing rapidly toward a dark shore, and that every time he had it, something terrible happened. He had it the night before the Battle of Antietam, and again before Gettysburg. And then there was the mirror. According to Mary Todd Lincoln, on the night of his first election, Lincoln looked into a mirror and saw two reflections of himself, one pale and one healthy. He interpreted it as an omen. He would win a second term, but would not survive it. He told several friends about it. Joked, sort of, but he believed it deep down. And then there's the left-hand thing. There's a document dated early 1863, a routine military appointment. The signature is shaky, drooping, unmistakably written with the wrong hand. That same week, Lincoln had been sleepless, hollow-eyed, pacing the White House as the Emancipation Proclamation loomed. He was terrified, not of the document, but of what it would unleash. He believed every major act carried consequence in ink. The way the pen touched paper, the steadiness of the line, the shape of the A. These weren't aesthetic details, they were moral indicators. He once remarked that he liked to feel the writing as it moved, and his friends noticed that when he was deeply troubled, he'd write in loops, almost compulsively, circles, ellipses, metaphysical knots. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, rarely slept. What he did was write, and when the writing came slowly or shook, he adjusted, not the pen, but the instrument of will. In a presidency defined by war, death, and impossible choices, the left hand became a kind of spiritual insurance policy. If the right hand wavered, it wasn't cowardice. It was respect. It was fear. It was a man saying, I will not stain the act with doubt. But here's the darker part. Sometimes the left-handed signatures appear on pardons, specifically pardons for young soldiers sentenced to death for desertion. Lincoln read everyone. He'd stay up late, hands trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion, and decide whether a boy lived or died. Sometimes, with a whisper, he'd switch hands and scrawl, let this boy live. You can almost hear him thinking, I won't let the trembling damn him. He didn't believe in execution as punishment. He believed it was the last gasp of a failed system. The battlefield decided so many things already. Did the firing squad need to take one more? So he signed. Sometimes with the hand that shook, sometimes with the hand that didn't. Either way, it mattered. And then, of course, there was April 14th, 1865. He spent the morning talking about dreams again. Told his cabinet he had seen a vision of the White House shrouded in mourning. Told them it didn't frighten him. Told them he had never felt more certain that the Union would survive. That night he went to the theater. That night he was shot. And in the days that followed, America would look back through the letters, the notes, the signatures, right-handed, left-handed, shaky, firm, and wonder, did he know? Because Lincoln didn't just sign documents. He signed moments. And every flick of the pen felt like a heartbeat in a country barely holding itself together. But if Lincoln channeled the tremble of destiny, the next president, he didn't wait to speak his truth. He just did it in his sleep. Because Andrew Johnson gave speeches whether people were listening or not, even when he was unconscious. Andrew Johnson gave some of his most passionate speeches while unconscious. Literally. He would talk in his sleep, loud enough for staff, guests, and, on one notable occasion, an entire boarding house to hear. Not mumbles, not snores, full speeches, rants, monologues, occasionally with gesturing. One aide described waking in the night to the sound of Johnson delivering what sounded like a veto address, pausing for imaginary applause, barking out phrases like, "The people must resist this tyranny," and then turning over and snoring like nothing had happened. Another claimed Johnson once sat upright in bed, raised his hand as if swearing an oath, and said, "Let it be known I shall answer only to the people, and perhaps to the Almighty." Then he fell back, unconscious, as if nothing had occurred. You could argue his unconscious speeches were more coherent than his conscious ones, because Johnson, when awake, had a habit of self-destructing in real time. Let's remember, this is the man who became president because Lincoln was murdered, and no one else really wanted the job. A Southerner loyal to the Union, Johnson was chosen as Lincoln's running mate in a gesture of wartime unity. He rewarded this trust by showing up drunk to his own inauguration as vice president. He slurred through his oath, forgot names, and launched into a chaotic speech that made even Lincoln visibly uncomfortable. It was the kind of performance that usually ends with someone saying, "Let's just call it a night." Johnson kept going for over 10 minutes. But the chaos didn't stop when the hangover wore off. Once president, Johnson treated the office like a stage for personal vindication. He saw Reconstruction as an insult. He vetoed civil rights legislation, pardoned Confederate leaders, and made speeches that sounded like angry Facebook posts in a time before the internet. At one point, he embarked on a national speaking tour known as the Swing Around the Circle, meant to rally support for his policies. Instead, it turned into a public relations disaster. He compared himself to Jesus, insulted hecklers, referred to Congress as a body hanging onto my coattails. Crowds booed. Papers roasted him. One editor wrote, "The president has declared war on syntax, sobriety, and sense." Harsh. Accurate. But at night, in sleep, Johnson became weirdly eloquent, eerily focused. His wife, Eliza, once remarked that he relived the day's politics in dreams, and that some of his most forceful arguments came at 2 a.m. while tangled in blankets, declaring constitutional principles to an audience of crickets. It's as if his waking mind couldn't handle the contradictions he embodied, and his subconscious took over like a frustrated ghost with something to say. And contradictions? He had plenty. Johnson was born in poverty, apprenticed to a tailor, taught himself to read, and rose through sheer stubborn grit. He hated elites, hated planners, hated anyone who spoke down to him. And yet, he also hated the idea of racial equality. He believed in union, but not in progress. He wanted unity, but only on his terms, which excluded entire swaths of the newly freed population. When Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting citizenship to freed slaves, Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode him. This would become a pattern: veto, override, repeat. Eventually, the House had enough. Johnson became the first president to be impeached. The charges were technical, centered around his firing of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, but the real crime was his total political incompetence. He survived the Senate vote by 1 vote, barely. History footnotes him as acquitted, but the nation had already passed judgment. He finished his term bitter, friendless, mumbling about betrayal. And then, like a man locked in a room full of his own echoes, he left Washington and returned to Tennessee, where he resumed giving midnight speeches, only now to an audience of furniture and faded portraits. He eventually returned to the Senate years later, the only former president to do so. But by then his voice had dulled. His audience was gone. His speeches were shorter, sleepier. There's something tragic about a president whose most consistent, passionate beliefs came out while he was dreaming, as if he could only express himself when the world wasn't watching, as if the shame of history needed to be whispered, so it could be forgotten by morning. But the next president, he didn't whisper. He didn't sleep much either. He left papers everywhere. Letters on the floor, uniforms on chairs, military reports stuffed in teacups, because Ulysses S. Grant was too busy surviving to bother cleaning up. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant lived like a tornado that had politely been asked to wear a suit, not because he was wild, not because he was careless, but because orders simply did not apply to him. His White House looked like the inside of a ransacked bookstore, and his personal quarters resembled a Civil War reenactment if the reenactors had all gone home drunk and left their epaulets behind. Clothes were flung across couches, books spilled onto tables, letters tucked inside boots, memoirs written on hotel stationery. If you handed Grant a report, you could assume within the hour it would be under a coffee mug beside a cigar, partially smudged with ink and possibly mustard, and he was entirely fine with this. Grant was a man of calm chaos. He hated pretension, refused to perform. At formal dinners, he'd shrug off etiquette. At state events, he sometimes forgot names and once referred to a foreign diplomat as the one with the medals. He didn't care, not because he was rude, but because he had other things to do. This is, after all, the man who defeated Robert E. Lee, who coordinated multi-front warfare across thousands of miles, who, during battle, once calmly lit a cigar while shells exploded within earshot. Grant didn't flinch in war, but give him a formal letter opener and he'd stare at it like it required a calculus degree. Even his desk, the physical and symbolic center of presidential power, was described by aides as a war zone of paperwork. One visitor remarked that it looked as though a windstorm had passed through the Treaty of Versailles and no one noticed. Another aide claimed that Grant once lost a speech in his own jacket. It had fallen into the lining. He shrugged and rewrote it from memory. But here's the twist. In that mess, he was weirdly efficient. He wrote quickly, decisively, bluntly. He didn't waffle. He didn't use extra words. His orders in war were direct. His vetoes were terse. His letters to his wife were heartfelt but never flowery. Grant hated verbosity. He once told a rambling senator, "I understood you in the first sentence, and now I'm just watching the dust settle." That's a burn so clean you can smell the parchment. But behind the mess and the brevity was a man who never asked for this. The presidency, the spotlight, the politics. Grant didn't want to be president. He didn't even want a campaign. But after the war, America needed a symbol of unity, a hero, a steady hand, and they dragged Grant, muddy boots and all, into the Oval Office. And here's where the mess turned metaphorical. Grant, for all his integrity, was a terrible judge of character. He trusted people he shouldn't have, appointed crooks, defended liars. He wasn't corrupt, but his administration became infamous for scandal. The credit mobilier scheme, the whiskey ring. Nepotism and bribery ran under his nose like rats in the pantry. Grant didn't orchestrate it. He didn't benefit from it, but he also didn't see it or didn't want to. When confronted with betrayal, he was often visibly hurt, not angry, just disappointed, like a man who believed so fiercely in loyalty that he couldn't accept its absence. One aide described him as the most trusting man ever to hold a knife in his back, and yet he kept going. After his presidency, he lost his fortune in a failed investment scheme. With creditors at the door and cancer eating away at him, Grant sat down and wrote his memoirs by hand, thousands of pages. No ghostwriter, no secretary, just him, a pen, and death closing in. He finished them days before he died. They became a bestseller. Mark Twain published them. They saved his family from poverty, and they remain to this day one of the finest autobiographies ever written by a president. So maybe the mess wasn't a flaw. Maybe it was the price of clarity. Because Grant understood war. He understood suffering. He understood how to keep moving when the world fell apart. He didn't care where the papers went or if the chairs were straight. He cared about doing the thing, even if the desk was on fire. But if Grant was chaos outside and steel inside, the next president, he wouldn't kill an ant. In fact, he once built a tiny bridge so ants could cross a path without harm. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes once paused a walk, on official presidential grounds no less, to construct a miniature bridge for a line of ants attempting to cross a gap in a path. He didn't call for help. He didn't just step over them. He knelt down, found a sliver of bark, and gently laid it across the crack, watching with quiet satisfaction as the ants marched forward in perfect, oblivious formation. This wasn't a one-time whim. Hayes had a rule: don't kill anything unnecessarily. And he meant it. He wouldn't swat mosquitoes. He refused to crush bugs. When flies buzzed through the White House windows, he didn't shoo them. He opened other windows, hoping they'd find their own way out. His staff called it eccentric. He called it a minor extension of justice. Rutherford B. Hayes, war veteran, lawyer, reformer, and secret saint of tiny lives. But here's the twist. This wasn't softness. This was discipline. Hayes wasn't naive. He'd seen combat, brutal, bloody, soul-pulping combat during the Civil War. He'd been wounded 5 times, once shot through the shoulder, once in the head. He was dragged off the battlefield unconscious and still returned to fight again. He didn't avoid violence because he didn't understand it. He avoided it because he understood it too well. So when he became president in 1877, after one of the most disputed elections in U.S. history, he brought with him not vengeance, not ambition, but a strange, fragile code of restraint. He installed honesty in a government rotting with patronage. He removed liquor from the White House, earning it the nickname the Dry House. He banned smoking indoors. He advocated for education over punishment in dealing with the post-Reconstruction South, and he built bridges, not just between North and South, but between idea and action, war and peace, ants and cracks. The man was obsessively moral. In his diary, he wrote, "Conscience is the compass. Not popularity, not wealth, conscience." That sounds noble until you realize it extended to every decision, from civil service reform down to which insects got a second chance at life. His wife, Lucy, the first lady with a college degree, shared this worldview. She banned alcohol, hosted sober events, and was dubbed Lemonade Lucy, a nickname meant to mock her that accidentally made her sound like a moral vigilante in a Victorian pulp novel. She and Rutherford were a team, equal parts reform and restraint. But restraint is not always popular. Hayes was mocked as bland, sanctimonious, dull. Political cartoonists drew him as a clock-watching bureaucrat, more concerned with rules than results. He never raised his voice, never started fights. Even when dealing with labor strikes and Southern insurgents, he sought compromise, not conquest. In an era obsessed with manliness as dominance, Hayes looked like a philosopher politely holding the republic together with string and well-meaning memos. And maybe that's why he built the bridge for the ants. Because when the whole world is in conflict, North versus South, labor versus capital, democracy versus corruption. What else can a decent man do but help something cross the road? But his legacy is blurry. He promised to serve only one term, and he did. He left office quietly, returned to Ohio, and spent his final years supporting prison reform and funding education for black children. He died in 1893, remembered less for any one great act and more for his daily acts of strange, unfashionable decency. Which brings us back to the ants. It wasn't just a bridge. It was a metaphor, a mission, a worldview in miniature. It wasn't about bugs. It was about not stepping on things just because you can. It was about imagining that the tiniest lives no one else would notice, deserved a clear path forward. And if Hayes built bridges for ants, the next president, he taught himself to read upside down so he could discreetly follow along during meetings because he knew what they were saying before they knew he was listening. James A. Garfield taught himself to read upside down, not as a party trick, not for attention. He did it so he could read over people's shoulders without them realizing he was already 5 paragraphs ahead. Ministers, generals, bureaucrats, none of them knew that while they explained things to him slowly. Garfield was already silently correcting their arguments. He did it as a child. Bored during long church sermons, he'd stare at other people's hymnals from behind or beside them, flipping the words in his head until they aligned. Later, as a teacher, he'd do the same with students' textbooks, reading along without ever looking like he was paying attention. It was a power move. It was an escape hatch. It was, above all else, Garfield in a nutshell. He was a quiet genius in a room full of loud men, fluent in Latin and Greek, mathematician, lawyer, preacher, general, college president, congressman, and eventually, of course, president. But unlike most polymaths who make you suffer for their brilliance, Garfield carried his intelligence like an overstuffed coat, heavy, practical, and always a little wrinkled. He was a humble intellectual, if such a thing can exist in Washington. He believed in thoughtful governance, and not just thoughtfulness as a virtue, but as a skill, a muscle to be exercised through reading, dialogue, and inversion. He often approached problems backward, read bills from the bottom up, reversed arguments to test their logic. Even his handwriting slanted the opposite direction, like he was resisting the gravitational pull of the page. His brain was a Rubik's Cube in boots, and most people didn't notice. He wasn't a celebrity general like Grant. He wasn't a fire breather like Jackson. He was quiet, modest, and famously difficult to categorize. In debates, he'd let others talk themselves into a corner, then gently suggest an alternative that completely dismantled their premise, like a man disarming a trap he himself had set. And that made him dangerous, because the most powerful man in the room isn't the one shouting. It's the one silently understanding you better than you understand yourself. His presidency, of course, was tragically short. He served just 199 days, shot by an angry office seeker named Charles Guiteau, a man convinced he deserved a political appointment, even though he was functionally unqualified and fully delusional. Guiteau stalked Garfield, approached him in a train station, and fired 2 bullets. One grazed him, the other lodged near his spine. And that's where the real tragedy began. Garfield didn't die right away. He lingered for 11 weeks, not because of the bullet, but because of the doctors. They probed the wound with unwashed hands. They refused to believe in antiseptic theory. They poked, prodded, experimented. Alexander Graham Bell even built a metal detector to locate the bullet, but was told to search only the wrong side of the body. The bullet didn't kill Garfield. American medicine did. All the while, he remained conscious, lucid, and heartbreakingly optimistic. He dictated policy, wrote letters, read books upside down and right side up. At one point, he asked his secretary to bring him a Greek text because if I'm going to suffer, I might as well suffer with Socrates. By the time he died, the country had come to adore him, quietly, the same way he governed. He didn't have time for a grand legacy, but he had style, subtlety, stillness, and that one uncanny skill, seeing what others missed, even from the wrong angle. Which is the real metaphor, isn't it? Garfield saw America not as it claimed to be, but as it looked from the side. Flawed, fascinating, full of promise, but built on contradictions. And maybe, just maybe, that's why someone like him couldn't last. Because turning the country upside down, gently, rationally, and with grace, isn't what the moment demanded. It wanted spectacle, and Garfield gave it understatement. But the next president, he believed colors had psychological power, that paint could influence policy, that the color of your walls could literally decide your fate. Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur believed in color psychology, not casually, not in a that's a nice shade of green kind of way. No, Arthur believed the color of the walls in a room could affect decision-making, emotional stability, and the very integrity of the executive branch. He once told a guest, dead serious, blue walls breed better decisions, and he meant it. He had the White House refurbished from floor to ceiling when he took office, not because it needed it, not because there was a leak, but because the colors were wrong. The emotional energy, as he saw it, was off. He threw out old furniture, tore down drapes, hired Louis Comfort Tiffany, the legendary designer, to create stained glass windows and kaleidoscopic partitions. The East Room was transformed into something out of a moody impressionist painting. The Blue Room became bluer. The Green Room became a carefully engineered forest of velvet and jade. One senator said entering the newly redesigned White House felt like walking into a dream where the furniture has opinions. And Arthur, he didn't just redecorate. He curated mood. He once paused a cabinet meeting to change the drapes because they were too red. That's not distraction, that's conviction. But the strangest thing about Arthur's obsession with environment was how it contrasted with his past. Before becoming president, he had been steeped in the New York political machine, specifically the notorious patronage system that greased every gear of government with nepotism, favors, and very quiet money. He was known as the gentleman boss, polished, charming, fashionable, and entirely complicit in the swamp. He wore the finest clothes in Washington, had over 80 pairs of pants, owned monogram boots, kept cologne in his desk drawer, and if you had asked anyone in D.C. what kind of president he would be, they'd have said utterly corrupt. Then something weird happened. James Garfield was assassinated. Arthur, the party hack, the crony's crony, the dandy with no moral compass, was suddenly president, and instead of embracing the power grab, he transformed. He refused to appoint old machine allies. He supported civil service reform. He defied the very people who had elevated him. It shocked everyone. It confused even him, and maybe that's where the colors come in. Because Arthur didn't just redecorate the White House, he redecorated himself, slowly, deliberately, quietly, like a man repainting his interior in real time. His newfound belief in aesthetics wasn't vanity, it was remodeling. He started staying up late, reading reports alone in mood-lit rooms. He stopped making patronage appointments and started questioning old friends. He became private, reflective, haunted even. His health began to fail. Bright's disease, a fatal kidney condition which he hid from the public. So, as he was physically wasting away, he was mentally cleaning house. One staffer wrote, "He governs as though arranging a study, with taste, restraint, and the odd obsession." Another said, "He seems unsure whether he's president or curator." Maybe he was both. His presidency was short, uneventful on the surface, but beneath it was a man grappling with who he had been and who he was supposed to be. His last year in office, he began taking walks, late at night, past the glowing windows of the White House, looking in like a man uncertain if he still belonged inside. He didn't seek re-election. Instead, he left behind blue walls, stained glass, and a political legacy no one expected. Quiet reform, moral evolution, and a belief that beauty can change behavior. Even in government, he died a year after leaving office. Alone, quiet, surrounded by silence and color. But if Arthur tried to reform his soul through color and light, the next president, he didn't just build a chair, he named it. He called it the seat of judgment, and he sanded it by hand for weeks. Grover Cleveland built his own chair, not a campaign prop, not a hobby project, a real functional, uncomfortable wooden chair that he sanded by hand over several weeks, shaping and refining it during late nights and long silences. When he finished, he gave it a name, not metaphorically, but literally. He called it the seat of judgment, and he meant it. This wasn't whimsical. This wasn't folksy Americana. This was Cleveland's internal wiring, externalized in oak. the man who would serve 2 non-consecutive terms as president, who vetoed more legislation than any of his predecessors, who treated executive power not as a privilege but as a burden, wanted something solid to sit in while he decided the fate of bills, appointments, and national priorities. So he built a chair, and then he sat in it, and then he judged. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't elegant, but it was deliberate, like the man himself. Cleveland didn't move through politics like a politician. He moved like an accountant with a moral hangover, stiff-backed, squinting, constantly doing the right thing even when it made everyone hate him. He vetoed pensions for Civil War veterans, not because he was heartless, but because the claims were fraudulent. He blocked subsidies for railroads, for farmers, for businesses, not because he opposed growth, but because he hated favoritism. He once vetoed a bill that would have given grain to starving Texas farmers. Starving farmers. And his reasoning? Though the people support the government should not support the people. That's not just cold. That's refrigerated philosophy. And yet, it wasn't cruelty. It was discipline. He believed the presidency was not a throne, but a vow, and vows are not meant to be broken for comfort, or popularity, or votes. And that chair, it wasn't just where he signed documents. It was where he decided. He reportedly never made major decisions unless seated in it. Some aides joked it was his confessional. Others said it was more like an altar. Either way, no one else was allowed to sit in it. Ever. He kept it in his study, even after his presidency, next to a small stack of veto messages and a drawer filled with letters he never sent. But here's the deeper contradiction. Grover Cleveland was, in many ways, a paradox in pants, a moralist who fathered a child out of wedlock, then took full responsibility for it, publicly, at great political cost, a crusader for fiscal restraint who secretly battled cancer during his second term, having surgery on a yacht to remove a tumor from his jaw so the stock market wouldn't panic, a private man in a public furnace. He was enormous, physically, politically, and ethically. He didn't bend, he didn't charm, he endured. He never gave soaring speeches, didn't flirt with grandeur, but he left behind thousands of pages of vetoes that read, like diary entries from a man slowly realizing no one else was willing to say no. He didn't build statues, he built chairs, uncomfortable ones. And maybe that's the point. Cleveland governed the way some people confess sins, uncomfortably, honestly, and knowing it will cost them. The seat of judgment wasn't just a quirky metaphor. It was a daily reminder that doing the right thing often feels terrible. But if Cleveland built his own judgment, the next president, he refused to put mirrors in his bedroom. Why? Because he believed they could trap dreams. Benjamin Harrison wouldn't allow mirrors in his bedroom. Not one, not a vanity, not a silverback travel piece, nothing reflective. And when asked why, he gave the kind of answer that stops conversation cold. They trap dreams. He didn't say it like a joke. He said it like a fact, like the way you might say fire burns or bullets kill, a truth carried in the bones. This was not a superstition in passing. It was policy. White House staff were instructed not to place mirrors near his sleeping quarters. Guests were gently redirected from discussing their dreams. And Harrison himself, the 23rd President of the United States, would reportedly wake from sleep in a cold sweat if even a glint of reflection was visible across the room. He believed mirrors watched. He believed they held on to things. Not just dreams, intentions, regrets, the afterimage of who you were when you weren't looking. And maybe that's why Harrison, a man of exact legal mind and iron political caution, ended up walking through the White House like a ghost in reverse, constantly erasing traces of himself before anyone else could reflect them back. To the public, he was stiff, quiet, short, a Civil War general turned senator turned president. His speeches were formal and a little cold, like legal briefs written in cursive. He rarely smiled unless he had to, never joked in public, refused to perform, but in private, he was haunted, not in the skeletons in the closet sense, though who among them didn't have a few, but haunted in the existential sense. He carried the weight of his lineage. He was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who died after 31 days in office. Benjamin outlived that benchmark, barely, but he still walked like a man waiting for the same illness to tap him on the shoulder. He worked with a kind of mechanical urgency, never quite at ease. Maybe that's why he feared mirrors, because they were reminders of legacy, of failure, of the time that kept passing, even when no one applauded. Even his policies reflected this cautious duality. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first major federal law to curb monopolies, but barely enforced it. He expanded the Navy, built up American foreign influence, but rarely boasted. He brought electric lights to the White House, but refused to touch the switch himself, fearing electrocution. A man caught between progress and paranoia. His presidency saw the first billion-dollar federal budget, earning criticism from fiscal conservatives. He defended it flatly, said nothing more, then went home and probably checked the halls for mirrors. He believed in governance like he believed in silence. Thoughtful, serious, morally upright, but never loud, never emotionally indulgent. He hated sentimentality, despised theatrics. He was the kind of president who could quote the Constitution in his sleep, but couldn't remember your birthday in person. And yet, the mirror thing never went away. A visiting dignitary once brought a jeweled hand mirror as a gift. Harrison declined it, not with offense, but with genuine discomfort. "I have no use for it," he said. "We are already too visible." That's the tragedy of Benjamin Harrison. He governed a growing nation while slowly vanishing himself. Even his re-election campaign was quiet, withdrawn, nearly spectral. He lost to Grover Cleveland, the same man he had beaten just 4 years earlier, the first time a president was defeated by the very man he had defeated. A perfect reversal, a historical mirror, and perhaps to Harrison, confirmation. He left office with barely a whisper, retired to Indianapolis, took long walks, kept no personal diary, maintained his legal practice until he died of pneumonia at 67. No scandal, no collapse. Just a man who lived precisely and left no reflection behind. Because to Harrison, dreams belonged to the dreamer, and the mirror was a thief. But if Harrison saw ghosts in glass, the next president, he carried cloves in a tiny silver box. Not for flavor, not for health, because he was addicted to chewing them. William McKinley chewed cloves, constantly, obsessively, not for cooking, not for tea. He chewed them like some men smoke, or pray. He carried a tiny silver box in his pocket at all times, polished and engraved, containing nothing but a neat row of dried cloves, hand-selected, aromatic, and eternally replenished. While other presidents reached for cigars or bourbon, McKinley would pause mid-sentence, flip open the box with the casual elegance of a man pulling out a pocket watch, and slide a clove between his teeth. The room would fill with the scent, medicinal, exotic, unnerving. Why cloves? Why not mints, gum, or some more respectable addiction? McKinley claimed it helped with nerves. He suffered from chronic tension, often masked beneath his dignified exterior. The cloves, he said, helped him think, helped him stay present. He would chew them during cabinet meetings, peace negotiations, even while walking through the halls of the White House in his signature starched collars and perfectly tailored waistcoats. One aide described the sound of cloves cracking between McKinley's molars as the background music of the presidency. But it wasn't just a habit. It was a ritual, something sacred, controlled, tactile. In a world of chaos, imperialism, war, tariffs, assassination threats, McKinley had one thing he could control, the clean, sharp burn of clove oil across his tongue. There's something fitting about it. McKinley's presidency was all about quiet escalation. He didn't shout. He didn't grandstand. But under his watch, America became an empire. The Spanish-American War, the annexation of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. He governed like a calm man preparing for a storm he already saw coming. And the clove chewing? It was like biting the storm back. And yet, for all his composure, McKinley was an emotional man. He doted on his wife, Ida, who suffered from epilepsy and severe depression. At public events, when she began to tremble, McKinley would gently cover her hands with a napkin or guide her to a quiet corner. No fuss, no shame, just protection. He was famous for remembering names, favors, small kindnesses, for being gentle, which makes his imperial legacy all the more bizarre. Because McKinley, this courteous man with clove-scented breath, presided over the bloody transformation of America into a global power. Under his orders, battleships were launched, colonies claimed, populations subjugated. He justified it as destiny, duty, and civilization. But at night, he'd sit by the fire, chewing cloves and reading the Bible. He was torn, and he knew it. In his last term, he considered letting go of the Philippines, talked openly about finding a peaceful resolution, reclaiming the republic from its colonial distractions, a new vision, a new direction. But then came Buffalo, the Pan American Exposition, 1901. McKinley stood to greet the public, no security, no hesitation. A man stepped forward, anarchist, revolver, 2 shots. As McKinley fell, bleeding, he whispered, "Let no one hurt him." Those were his first words about the man who shot him. His second words, "Be careful how you tell Ida." He died 8 days later, and when they cleaned out his personal effects, they found the silver clove box, still full, still shining. It's an odd legacy, a man remembered for kindness, killed at the peak of his power, leaving behind a country bigger than it had ever been, and a scent, that odd, warm, bittersweet scent, not tobacco, not gunpowder, just cloves, something so small, so sharp, so human. But if McKinley bit back the stress with spice, the next president, he fought stress by flipping people in the East Room, wearing a suit, because Theodore Roosevelt didn't chew. He grappled. Theodore Roosevelt practiced jiu-jitsu in the White House in full suit and tie. On the same floor where state dinners were held and dignitaries were toasted, Roosevelt was flipping men onto their backs like it was a dojo built on marble and legacy. This wasn't recreational. This wasn't some early 20th century Pilates class. This was Roosevelt's full-body expression of political philosophy. If the world tries to tackle you, tackle it first, and harder. He once sparred with a Japanese naval attaché so vigorously in the East Room that he tore his shoulder muscle clean off the bone. Did he stop? Of course not. He shook it off, bandaged it up, and didn't tell anyone for weeks. When the press asked about his sudden sling, he deflected with a joke about wrangling bears. Classic Teddy. But jiu-jitsu wasn't a phase. It was part of a larger worldview Roosevelt called the strenuous life, the belief that personal weakness was a moral failing and that only through challenge, physical, intellectual, emotional, could a man reach his highest self. Roosevelt lived it like scripture. He boxed. He climbed mountains. He read entire books before breakfast. He once delivered a 90-minute speech with a bullet in his chest. He was, by every measure, a man uncomfortably allergic to stillness. The White House during his term, less stately manner, more organized brawl. His children turned the halls into obstacle courses. He welcomed pets that included a badger, a hyena, and a one-legged rooster. He wrestled with staff, rode horses at dawn, and once leapt into a creek during a policy walk, fully clothed, just to prove he still could. And yet, it wasn't bravado. It was grief. It was coping. Because behind the lung power and punchlines, Roosevelt was running from silence. His first wife, Alice, and his mother died on the same day, in the same house, when he was just 25. He marked the page of his diary with a large black X and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." He never spoke of Alice again, not to friends, not to family, not even to their daughter, who bore her name. And from that point on, Roosevelt filled every quiet space with motion. Pain became productivity. Loss became speed. Stillness became the enemy. So jiu-jitsu? Not just sport, exorcism. Every throw, every break fall, every sweat-stained collar was a way of saying, I am still here. I am still fighting. I cannot be erased. And yet, as president, he was no brawler in policy. He was calculated, brilliant, progressive. He took on the trusts, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, the railroad barons, and broke them apart with legal precision. He negotiated peace between Russia and Japan, winning a Nobel Peace Prize. He invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House, setting off a firestorm of Southern outrage and standing firm. He wasn't afraid of fights. He was afraid of irrelevance. After leaving office, he got bored and tried to run again. When he lost the nomination, he formed his own party, the Bull Moose Party, named after an animal he described as perfectly willing to charge a moving train. At one campaign stop, a would-be assassin shot him in the chest. The bullet passed through his overcoat, his eyeglass case, his steel-reinforced speech, yes, really, and lodged in his muscle. He stepped up to the podium anyway and said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," then spoke for 90 minutes, bleeding. But the man who could bench press the Republic couldn't hold off time. He died in his sleep at 60. His son wired the family. The old lion is dead. A nation mourned. Even his political enemies paused, because there would never be another Teddy. Only the stories, the punches, the prints on the marble floor of the East Room, where a president once practiced jujitsu in his best suit, daring history to try him. But if Roosevelt wrestled with reality, the next president, he wrestled with dessert. He never skipped it. Banana cream pies, custards, puddings, he adored them all. Because when you're the heaviest president in U.S. history, you don't just eat history. You sit in it. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft never skipped dessert, ever. Banana cream pie, custard, butterscotch pudding, peach cobbler, layered cakes stacked like judicial arguments. He adored them with the kind of enthusiasm most politicians reserve for lobbyists and oil. If Roosevelt was a fist in motion, Taft was a pastry in repose. But here's the twist. Taft didn't eat like a hedonist. He ate like a man trying to fill something. And that's the strange, poignant irony of his presidency, because behind every pudding cup was a man who never really wanted the job he was given and tried to make it palatable. Taft didn't want to be president. He wanted to be a judge. His lifelong dream, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, quiet, rational, no speeches, no campaigns, just law and logic and the occasional eclair. But Roosevelt, his friend and political patron, all but pressured him into running. "You're the only man who can carry on my legacy," Roosevelt insisted. Taft, ever the loyal friend, obliged. He won the 1908 election reluctantly, and the White House got softer, not in intellect, not in policy, but in ambiance. Where Roosevelt filled rooms with fire and fists, Taft filled them with furniture. Massive chairs, cozy drapes, thick antique rugs, a reading room that often smelled like pastry glaze and pipe tobacco. He didn't punch the air. He considered it thoughtfully, then filed a report. And yes, he was heavy, at his peak, over 340 pounds. But this wasn't a punchline. It was a presence. He reportedly got stuck in a White House bathtub, which may or may not be true. What is true is that after the incident, or rumor, he ordered a new tub large enough to fit 4 grown men. It arrived. It was installed. It was majestic. Taft bathed like a Roman senator in retirement, but the real weight wasn't his body. It was the expectation. He was supposed to carry Roosevelt's legacy, be the next fighter, the next reformer, the next titan. Instead, Taft governed with measured restraint. He believed in the law. He believed in process. He refused to wield emotion as policy, which made him unpopular almost immediately. Roosevelt, watching from the sidelines, grew impatient, accused Taft of betrayal, ran against him. Their friendship shattered in a hailstorm of campaign speeches and awkward public tension. In 1912, they both lost to Woodrow Wilson. Taft was crushed, personally, politically. Physically, he was exhausted. But here's where it gets good. After leaving office, he finally got the role he'd always wanted. In 1921, President Harding appointed him as Chief Justice of the United States. Taft wept, said he was happier than he had ever been. One aide noted, his shoulders dropped 20 pounds the day he put on those robes. Probably true, metaphorically, maybe even literally. As Chief Justice, he flourished. He streamlined the court system, improved working conditions, wrote opinions with clarity and conviction. He finally got to operate in a world that made sense, where words mattered more than weight, and no one asked what flavor of pie he preferred, though, for the record, it was banana cream. He served until weeks before his death. He had his ashes buried under a stone inscribed not with President, but Chief Justice, the only man in U.S. history to hold both titles. But only one made him whole. Because Taft wasn't the wrong man for history. He was just in the wrong office, and while the world mocked him for his size, it missed the point. He wasn't trying to fill a chair. He was trying to find one that fit. But if Taft filled his presidency with pudding and protocol, the next president, he filled the margins with a red pen because he hated commas so much that he once rewrote an entire government document just to take them all out. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson hated commas. Not disliked, not avoided, hated. He called them clutter. He called them hesitation marks. He once referred to a particularly long sentence in a diplomatic cable as a crime of pauses, and on one now legendary occasion, he edited an entire government document just to remove the commas. Every single one. It wasn't just grammatical nitpicking, it was ideological. To Wilson, commas were weakness, the crack in the voice, the stammer in the soul. He believed in directness, discipline, precision. If a sentence needed a pause, it probably needed a rewrite. And if it couldn't be rewritten, maybe the idea itself was flawed. That was Wilson, a man who didn't just question your sentence structure, he questioned your moral clarity, and this made him both incredibly effective and utterly insufferable. Before becoming president, Wilson was an academic tyrant, a scholar, a professor, then president of Princeton University, where he famously tried to remake the institution in his image, by which we mean ordered, hierarchical, and comma-free. He argued with faculty, clashed with trustees, restructured departments like he was conducting a war game. He was brilliant, yes, but also cold, distant, the kind of man who edited other people's speeches unprompted and once rewrote a family friend's sermon in the margins, then handed it back like he was returning a misfiled tax document. By the time he became the 28th president of the United States, he brought that same editor's hand to global affairs. Wilson didn't just want to lead, he wanted to revise the country, the government, the world. He introduced the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, the progressive income tax. He reduced tariffs, oversaw major antitrust actions. He cleaned up economic grammar, reshaped the subject-verb agreement of American power, and then World War I. Wilson kept America out of the war until he didn't. Then he drafted one of the most famous foreign policy documents in modern history, the 14 Points. It was less a speech than a manifesto, a syllabus for civilization, a global edit. And again, barely a comma in sight. His ultimate goal? The League of Nations, an international body meant to prevent future wars through diplomacy, order, and shared rules. It was in many ways Wilson's final draft of the world, a paragraph in history he thought could be perfectly punctuated. But the Senate rejected it, and Wilson cracked. In 1919, while on a tour to rally support for the League, he collapsed. Stroke, partial paralysis, blurred vision, and for nearly a year and a half, the President of the United States was functionally incapacitated. His wife, Edith Wilson, acting as the de facto steward of the presidency, not officially, not constitutionally, just invisibly. Which raises a chilling question. Who governed the country during that time? Was it Wilson? Or was it the shadow of a man who once edited punctuation like it was destiny? He never truly recovered. He spent his final days in a dark Washington townhouse, curtains drawn, body failing. When asked if he regretted anything, he reportedly stared out the window and said nothing. But his papers, his speeches, his treaties, still clean. No pauses, no clutter, no allowances for ambiguity. Because Wilson didn't just fear mistakes, he feared indecision. And commas, they were indecision made visible. But if Wilson tried to reorder the world with red ink and resolve, the next president, he solved nothing. Just lit cognac-soaked cigars and watched the smoke spiral like a dying applause. He called them slow applause for the lungs. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding loved cigars. Not just the usual fat, smoky, after-dinner kind. Cognac-soaked, hand-rolled, dipped, dried, and lit with theatrical flair. He called them, without irony, slow applause for the lungs. That's not a smoking habit. That's a worldview. A belief that if the world's gonna fall apart, you might as well enjoy the ambiance. And Harding, he presided over a presidency so riddled with corruption, it might as well have been ashtrayed from the start. But let's start with the aesthetic. Harding was suave, handsome, deep-voiced, the kind of man who looked like he'd been cut from a 1920s newspaper ad for men's suits. His friends called him Warren. His enemies also called him Warren, because no one could really bring themselves to fear a man who looked like a kind uncle with bad judgment. He smoked constantly, slowly, elegantly. One staffer said the Oval Office smelled like a jazz club if the jazz had anxiety. His cognac-dipped cigars weren't for nerves. They were for mood, for pacing, for pretending that everything was under control while the foundation cracked underfoot. Because beneath the cigar haze, Harding's presidency was unraveling in real time. His administration was riddled with grift, the Teapot Dome scandal, an oil leasing corruption debacle that still holds the record for most brazen use of the federal government as a cash machine. Cabinet members were selling influence, siphoning money, handing out favors like party cigars. Harding didn't engineer it. He just let it happen. He once admitted out loud that he was in over his head. I am not fit for this office and never should have been here. Not a private diary confession, not a posthumous quote. A direct statement to a journalist. And yet, he stayed. Because Harding, for all his charm, was a passenger. He rode the presidency like a trolley car, fascinated by the view, unnerved by the controls. He loved people too much. Couldn't say no, couldn't confront. His appointments were based on loyalty, friendship, shared cigars, and political IOUs. He wanted to please, to charm, to be liked. And in doing so, he filled the government with con artists wearing waistcoats. His speeches were famously vague. He spoke of normalcy, a word he practically invented, like he was trying to summon the return of an America that had never quite existed. He wanted calm, prosperity, peace. But what he got was rot and the smell of burning tobacco. Even his personal life was smoky. He had multiple affairs, including a years-long relationship with a woman named Carrie Phillips, who may or may not have been a German sympathizer during World War I. He also fathered a child out of wedlock with Nan Britton, a much younger woman whose tell-all memoir scandalized the country and sold very well, thank you. But Harding's real tragedy wasn't the affairs. It wasn't even the scandals. It was the emptiness. He wanted to be loved, but didn't know how to lead. He wanted calm, but didn't know how to create it. So he sat in his chair, lit another cognac-drenched cigar, and let the silence applaud. In 1923, during a trip to the West Coast, perhaps sensing the end, he said to his staff, I hope the American people will think kindly of me. Then he collapsed in bed, died days later, heart failure. One of his last official acts, pardoning a man for bootlegging whiskey, a poetic gesture, if unintentional. And when the smoke cleared, all that was left was the echo of the scandals, the smell of scorched ambition, and a collection of half-finished speeches filled with big words and small meanings. But if Harding inhaled smoke to soften the collapse, the next president, he believed in one sacred accessory, a single piece of fabric. He wore a red tie every Wednesday because he called it the pivot point of the week. Calvin Coolidge, every Wednesday, Calvin Coolidge wore a red tie. Not maroon, not burgundy, red, bright, assertive, and intentional. He called it the pivot point of the week, as if the tie, not Congress, not crises, not public will, was what turned the gears of democracy from Tuesday into Thursday. It wasn't superstition, it wasn't fashion, it was schedule-based metaphysics. Coolidge, the 30th president of the United States, did not govern with speeches, charisma, or grand visions. He governed with time blocks, with ritual, with rules, with a silent internal metronome ticking exactly 4 beats per sentence. If Warren G. Harding was a smoky jazz club, Calvin Coolidge was a pocket watch in a drawer. Tidy, quiet, slightly eerie. They called him Silent Cal, and he lived up to it. He once greeted a woman at a dinner party who said, Mr. President, I bet my friend I could get you to say more than 2 words. Coolidge replied, you lose. And that was the entire conversation. He hated small talk, despised wasteful words. He'd read newspapers with a red pencil and circle phrases he considered unnecessary. He didn't argue. He trimmed. He didn't debate. He nodded. He believed governance was not a performance, but a function, and his own role in it minimized friction, which brings us back to the red tie. Wednesday to Coolidge was the week's turning hinge. Monday and Tuesday were for analysis. Thursday and Friday were for action. Wednesday, reflection, adjustment. The red tie marked that moment, like the strike of a small presidential bell. It was always the same shade, always silk, always knotted with perfect symmetry. Aides noticed, no one dared ask. One finally did years later, and Coolidge just said, it helps me think. That was it. End of explanation. Red equals focus. Next question. But beneath the ritual and rigidity was something stranger, a man who may have actually preferred not to exist. Coolidge didn't like being seen. He didn't like being photographed. He didn't want to be remembered. When reporters asked about his legacy, he said, "It is better to be silent and be thought dull than to speak and remove all doubt." A paraphrase, yes, but one he lived by. He slept 10 hours a night, took long naps during the day, sometimes twice. His schedule looked less like a leader's calendar and more like that of a very self-aware house cat, but that didn't make him lazy. He was ruthlessly efficient, cutting the federal budget, shrinking taxes, and reducing national debt. He believed the presidency wasn't there to create new ideas, but to keep bad ones out. He vetoed bills not because he disliked them, but because they were messy. He wanted governance to be clean, sharp, and silent, like a freshly ironed red tie, and it worked for a while. The country prospered, the economy boomed, jazz soared. Everyone assumed the quiet meant things were stable. But silence is not the same as structure. And when the markets cracked in 1929, just months after Coolidge had left office, the silence began to collapse. Coolidge didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say much at all. He returned to Northampton, Massachusetts, took long walks in winter coats, and faded into the same air he'd barely disturbed. One day, a reporter asked how he managed to stay so calm in the face of power. Coolidge pointed to a clock on the wall and said, "It ticks whether you notice or not," which is either brilliant or haunting. Maybe both. He died in 1933 of heart failure, alone in his room, no red tie that day, and so passed the quietest man ever to control the loudest office in the world, a man who believed time was sacred, words were dangerous, and the middle of the week deserved its own uniform. But if Coolidge governed through stillness, the next president, he refused to let anything beautiful die indoors, including flowers. He said, "They die in the open. Let's not rush it indoors," and meant every single word. Herbert Hoover wouldn't allow flowers in the house. Not for show, not for scent, not even during state visits. He once told a staffer, "They die in the open. Let's not rush it indoors." And meant it. This wasn't a decorating preference. It was a moral stance. To Hoover, placing cut flowers in a vase was akin to accelerated decay. It was cruelty by arrangement, a silent act of domestic euthanasia. If beauty was going to fade, let it fade honestly, under the sun, not under chandeliers. As president, Hoover insisted that White House floral arrangements be made from potted plants, alive, rooted, capable of continued existence, not clipped tokens of cheer destined to wilt by Wednesday. He saw vases as tombs, water as embalming fluid, petals as slow confessions of loss. Yes, he had opinions. And that tells you everything about Herbert Hoover, a man who didn't just notice suffering, he tried desperately to engineer around it. He was, after all, an engineer by trade, a mining magnate, a global relief coordinator, a man who once fed over 10 million people in Europe during World War I by orchestrating one of the most massive food relief operations in history. He was called the Great Humanitarian, and it wasn't hyperbole. He believed in systems, numbers, order, humanity as a problem set, suffering as a solvable equation, and when the Great Depression struck, he tried to apply those same principles. He saw the stock market crash not as a cataclysm, but as a structural imbalance, something to correct, calibrate, manage. He held meetings, built committees, tried public works programs, offered tax cuts, created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to stabilize the banks. But every solution was too technical, too slow, or too indirect to matter fast enough. People wanted fire. They got flowcharts. And Hoover, like the flower, withered indoors. He didn't lack compassion. He just didn't trust emotion to solve things. He feared it because emotion was chaos, and chaos was what he had spent his whole life trying to build walls against. That's why he hated flowers, because they died too easily. And America was dying. Soup lines stretched for blocks. Farmers lost their land. Unemployment soared past 20%. People lived in makeshift camps sarcastically named Hoovervilles. He visited none of them. He couldn't. Not emotionally, not politically. He believed the president should not appear to panic. So he stayed inside and kept the flowers out. When protesters, the Bonus Army, a group of 17,000 World War I veterans, marched on Washington in 1932, demanding early payment of promised bonuses, Hoover responded with military force. Tanks, bayonets, his legacy, tear gas and flames. It sealed his fate. He lost re-election in a landslide to Franklin Roosevelt, and when he finally left the White House, amid boos, mockery, and widespread contempt, he took with him his distaste for dying flowers and any optimism for political redemption. But here's the strange twist. He got it. Decades later, after FDR's death, Truman invited Hoover back into public service. He helped restructure post-war Europe. Again, he redesigned the executive branch's administrative systems. He wrote books. He lived to be 90, and slowly the same man who had been blamed for the Great Depression became something quieter, wiser, a survivor, not of politics, but of grief. And maybe that's the point. Hoover didn't hate flowers. He hated what they represented, beauty guaranteed to end. So he refused to place them in rooms where he worked, where problems bloomed and wilted, where people expected miracles from systems not built for them. But if Hoover tried to outlast mortality with systems and soil, the next president, he thought beer was a loaf of bread in a bottle and refused to drink it. Even during Prohibition, Franklin Delano Roosevelt hated beer. Not casually, not politely, not, no thank you, I'll have a wine. He despised it, loathed it. Once referred to it as a loaf of bread in a bottle. That wasn't a joke. That was culinary philosophy. To Roosevelt, beer was bloated, flat, and intellectually lazy. Wine, cultured, spirits, civilized. But beer was working-class white noise. And this becomes hilarious and ironic when you remember that FDR is the president who ended Prohibition. The very man who popped the cork on America's long, thirsty hangover wouldn't touch a pint. He drank cocktails, martinis mainly, shaken sloppily, mixed with whatever was on hand, and served at White House dinners that were equal parts glamour and improvisation. His martinis were famously bad, oversized, underdiluted, and occasionally tinted with absinthe or orange juice depending on his mood. Guests said they were undrinkable. FDR called them stimulating. But beer, never. Not even to toast victory. Not even for show. When Prohibition ended in 1933, thanks in no small part to Roosevelt's own 21st Amendment push, the country erupted in cheers. Breweries fired up again. Taverns reopened. Citizens popped bottles and sang in the streets. FDR raised a glass of gin, because beer to Roosevelt represented everything he had spent a career politely ignoring. The blunt, the bland, the everyman, and Roosevelt was never an everyman. He spoke like a patrician stage actor, smiled like a sphinx, wore tailored suits, and carried a cigarette holder like it was a conductor's baton. His charm wasn't casual. It was crafted, layered, practically embroidered. Even his paralysis, caused by polio at 39, was managed like a theatrical illusion. He built elaborate stagecraft around his physical limitations. Ramps, rails, specially timed photo ops. He projected strength at all costs, and maybe that's why he hated beer. Because beer's relaxed, uncomposed, honest. And FDR had no time for that. He led through precision, not foam. He spoke in fireside chats, measured, warm, designed to make you believe the world could be fixed with tone, and sometimes that illusion worked. During the Great Depression, he launched the New Deal, a sprawling collection of programs, reforms, and alphabet agencies designed to rebuild the country's economic soul. He fought polio in private and panic in public. He redefined the presidency as performance fused with policy, but he never faked enthusiasm, not even for beer. One journalist once asked him, during a tour of a reopened brewery, if he'd sampled a new lager. FDR smiled, raised his martini, and said, "Why fill the stomach when you can stir the mind?" That's Roosevelt, a man who delivered 4 terms, a world war, a reshaped economy, and still maintained cocktail hour like it was part of the Constitution. And then he was gone. April 12th, 1945. Sudden cerebral hemorrhage. His final words, "I have a terrific headache." Then silence. No toast. No beer. The country mourned. Loudly. For days. But the glass he raised remains sharp, elegant, and untouched by ale. Because for FDR, the presidency was not about what you could digest. It was about what you could distill. But if Roosevelt rejected beer as beneath him, the next president, he rejected dogs. Not emotionally, just situationally. He spent 6 months feeding a stray cat at the White House, thinking it was a pet. It was not. Harry S. Truman had a stray cat. He fed it for 6 months. Named it. Talked to it. Let it lounge near the rose garden. Staff assumed it was his. A Secret Service assumed it was part of the household. It wasn't. One day, a gardener politely informed the president that the cat didn't actually belong to anyone. It just wandered in. A drifter, a feline squatter with good instincts and a taste for presidential tuna. Truman reportedly just nodded and said, well, he knew where the food was. Classic Truman. Because Truman, more than any other 20th century president, was accidental by design. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. He'd been FDR's vice president for 82 days before Roosevelt dropped dead, and the fate of the atomic bomb landed on his lap like a hot potato in a funeral home. No security briefing, no warning, no special folders with labels like, "Welcome to ending the world." Just, surprise, you're the president. Also, here's your nuclear arsenal. And he handled it. Not with polish, not with poetry, but with a kind of Missouri grimness that made him both underestimated and unstoppable. He was short, blunt, bespectacled. He played piano, loved bourbon, wrote blisteringly honest letters, and called critics snivellers and lunatics with delightful regularity. His staff once described him as a haberdasher with a flamethrower. And yes, he ran a failed hat shop before entering politics. But here's the thing. He knew who he was, and that's rare. He didn't fake charm, didn't decorate his words, didn't particularly like ceremony. He once said, "I sit here all day trying to persuade people to do the things they ought to have the sense to do without my persuading them," which is basically the job description of the presidency, distilled into exasperated Midwestern clarity. So why the cat? Maybe because, like Truman, it didn't pretend. It didn't ask for a title. It didn't bark. It didn't follow orders. It just showed up, and he respected that. He didn't dress it in patriotic ribbons or use it for press photos. He fed it, let it hang around. Then, when told it didn't belong, he shrugged and kept feeding it anyway. Because Truman didn't believe in performance. He believed in function, in loyalty, in getting things done without making a mess, or pretending there wasn't one, and that principle extended from feline diplomacy to full-scale military command. He integrated the armed forces, fired General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War, a beloved national hero, for insubordination, faced the wrath of the public, did it anyway. He left office in 1953 deeply unpopular. His approval ratings sat in the 20s. People were tired of war, tired of inflation, tired of his plain-spoken refusal to tell them what they wanted to hear, so he went home to Independence, Missouri, took walks, wrote letters, paid for his own stamps, refused a pension until Congress offered one not just for him, but all future ex-presidents. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, all came out of that plain, piano-playing, cat-feeding machine of a man. And still, he was never fully embraced. Until later, much later. Now he's considered one of the best presidents in American history. But in life, Truman stayed humble, cranky, practical. He once said of his legacy, "History will do what it wants. I've got mail to answer, and presumably a cat to feed." But if Truman quietly governed while befriending a ghost cat, the next president, he once invited Winston Churchill to golf on his birthday, and then beat him, badly, as if the Allies hadn't suffered enough. Dwight D. Eisenhower invited Winston Churchill, former British Prime Minister, wartime drinking partner, and global icon, to play a round of golf. It was Churchill's birthday, a gentleman's match, a quiet afternoon of diplomacy. Except Eisenhower didn't go easy. He played hard, focused, unflinching. He beat Churchill badly. And when a staffer asked if perhaps he should have let Churchill win, Eisenhower reportedly said he wouldn't have respected that. Then he teed off again. That's Eisenhower in a sentence. a man who understood war, mastered peace, and governed like golf. Slow, steady, merciless. He didn't shout, he didn't bluff. He just kept outmaneuvering everyone. And yes, Ike played a lot of golf, reportedly over 800 rounds during his 2 terms as president. There was a putting green installed at the White House. Cabinet meetings were sometimes scheduled around tea times, but it wasn't laziness. It was strategy. Eisenhower believed golf revealed character. Who bent rules, who played clean, who collapsed under pressure. It was his silent vetting process. And more than a few political careers rose or fell by how well someone handled the back nine. And while he played, he remembered everything, because under that grandfatherly grin was a ruthless logistical mind. The same mind that orchestrated Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. D-Day wasn't luck. It was Eisenhower. Every ship, every parachute, every false weather report, every contingency plan, he understood complexity, but he loved clarity. He once described leadership as the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because he wants to do it, which sounds like Jedi mind control, but was really just his version of politics, quiet coercion, and he brought that same philosophy to the presidency. He ended the Korean War, built the interstate highway system, warned, famously, about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address, and all without breaking a sweat. But don't confuse calm for weakness. Eisenhower could cut you off at the knees with a smile. He rarely raised his voice, but when he disagreed with someone, they knew, instantly, often permanently. He played politics the same way he played Churchill. No mercy, no mulligans, just swing. And Churchill, to his credit, respected it. He returned home a bit winded, a bit humiliated, and reportedly told a friend, "The Americans are still good at war, even if it's only on grass." But here's the twist. Eisenhower didn't want to be president. He was begged into it. Both parties tried to recruit him. Truman literally offered to run as his vice president if he joined the Democrats. He said no. Then the Republicans tried, and he caved, because Ike didn't believe in ambition for its own sake. He believed in duty, in stepping up when the world needed you, and stepping down when it didn't. And that's how he governed. From behind his grin, from under his cap, silently driving the ball 250 yards straight into the historical fairway. But if Eisenhower led like a general in a golf cart, the next president, he read 6 newspapers and a book before breakfast. Because knowledge wasn't power to him, it was oxygen. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy read 6 newspapers and a book before breakfast. Every day, without fail, often while sipping orange juice and issuing national policy like he was narrating a cocktail party with nuclear codes. He didn't read for leisure. He read for survival. Reading wasn't a hobby. It was his operating system. The way others breathed or blinked, Kennedy consumed words, fast, endlessly, without a break. One aide remarked, he didn't just read things. He absorbed them, like he was trying to memorize the future before it arrived. And that made sense, because Kennedy's presidency was all future. Fast cars, Cold War, satellite feeds, Berlin walls, moonshots. The world was changing by the minute, and JFK was sprinting to stay 1 second ahead. He wasn't built for slowness. He had back pain, war wounds, and adrenal issues. He walked like a man whose spine was on strike, but his mind, pure jet propulsion. He spoke in bursts, short sentences, poetic logic. He could thread a speech like a novelist and cut down a critic with a single word. But what really terrified him? Not knowing. That's why he devoured books, cables, memos, briefings, anything with text. He read so fast, he took speed reading courses in college to go faster. He once claimed to read 1,200 words per minute, unverified, probably exaggerated, but somehow believable. He read Hemingway, Churchill, Aristotle, James Bond novels, CIA dossiers. He annotated poetry and memorized diplomatic rosters. He didn't believe in luck, he believed in readiness. And yet, it wasn't just knowledge, it was performance. Because Kennedy wasn't just smart, he was brilliantly staged. He knew exactly how he looked, how he sounded, how to turn fact into feeling. He curated silence, timed smiles like film edits. And when he dropped a quote from Plato or Pope or Frost, It didn't feel rehearsed. It felt inevitable, like gravity. But beneath the speed and charm was a constant anxiety. He once said, "Life is unfair," not as a complaint, but as a diagnosis. He knew death was coming. He'd nearly died from illness, from war, from Addison's disease. He wore a back brace under his perfectly tailored suits that held him upright, stiff, presidential, and vulnerable. He could barely bend. He just leaned, smiled, and read everything before it got to him. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, while the world held its breath, Kennedy was reading Soviet strategy like it was a poorly written thriller. He paced. He skimmed. He inhaled opinions, filtered them, and spit out nuclear doctrine with a raised eyebrow. He didn't blink, and neither did Khrushchev. He pushed for civil rights, not with LBJ's fire, but with slow, deliberate courage. He promised the moon, not metaphorically, literally. He debated Nixon not just with facts, but with light angles and charisma ratios. He was fast, but not reckless. He saw the presidency not as a throne or a burden, but a desk, covered in papers, and if he read fast enough, maybe he could solve it. But then Dallas. A slow turn, a sunny day, a bullet, a blink, a page unturned, and the book closed. No dramatic last words, just motion. Stopped. But if Kennedy died mid-sentence, the next president, he entered with a bark. Two of them, in fact. Named him and her. And he would soon lift them by their ears, on camera. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson had two beagles. Named him and her. Yes, those were their actual names. He would call out, "Come here, him," and sit, her, like he was barking orders at pronouns. It was weird, but that wasn't the weird part. One day, while showing off the pups to reporters on the White House lawn, LBJ reached down, grabbed him by the ears, and lifted him off the ground, on camera, photographed, widely distributed. The dog looked confused. America looked furious. Animal lovers howled. Headlines shrieked. Columnists tore him apart. And Johnson, he didn't understand the outrage. He said, "Folks down in Texas lift dogs that way all the time," which was not an apology. More like a cultural shrug with a southern drawl, because Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't live in a world of delicacy. He lived in a world of pressure. He was a manipulator by nature, an operator of people, legislation, momentum. He towered at 6 feet, 4 inches, leaned in close, and used his entire body like a political crowbar. The Johnson treatment was legendary, a combination of proximity, persuasion, sweat, and psychological warfare. Senators described it like being slowly devoured by a bear in a suit. He would corner you in a hallway. Repeat your name, a lot. Quote your voting record. Mention your wife's charity work. Remind you of a pending dam project in your district. Then, pause. Smile. And say something like, "Now I know you're going to do the right thing for America." And somehow you did, because LBJ didn't negotiate. He compelled, and this didn't stop at policy. He conducted meetings in the bathroom, literally, while seated on the presidential toilet, door open, aides taking notes. He shouted orders from the shower, dictated memos while dressing. He once held a press gaggle while his shirt was still unbuttoned, and asked a reporter to hand him his pants. He wasn't being weird. He was being efficient. Time was power, and power had no pause button. So the Beagle incident, it wasn't cruelty. It was command. LBJ thought, "These are my dogs. These are my ears. This is my White House. What's the problem?" He didn't do nuance. He did results. And results? He had them. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, the War on Poverty, the Great Society. He reshaped the American government more than any president since FDR, and he did it while sweating through a tan suit and reciting legislative arithmetic like a Texas auctioneer. But Vietnam, always Vietnam. He escalated the war, justified it, expanded it, and it broke him. Behind the beagle lifting, the profanity, the thunderous presence, was a man tormented by death counts and nightly maps. He watched names roll in, letters sent out, approval ratings sink. He whispered to aides that he knew he'd be remembered as the man who got us stuck. And so, in 1968, with the world watching, he announced he wouldn't run again. Not because he couldn't win, because he couldn't carry it anymore. The Beagles faded from memory. The policies remained. The war dragged on. And Johnson went home to Texas, quieter, older, withered from the burden. He died 4 years later. Heart failure. But the truth is, his heart had been failing for a while. Because for all his noise and sweat and fury, LBJ was a man who wanted to fix things, even if it meant breaking himself. But if Johnson held power like a sledgehammer, the next president, he played the piano, Chopin, Beethoven, by ear, because when Nixon wasn't taping everything, he was tuning out. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon could play Beethoven, Chopin, American standards, by ear, not badly either, not plink novelty. He played with actual skill, fingers moving across the keys like he was rewriting his legacy one soft arpeggio at a time. But here's the twist. He almost never played in public. He didn't want the applause. He didn't want the cameras. He wanted the control. Nixon didn't just play music. He escaped into it. When things got tense in the West Wing, Nixon would disappear into a small side room with a baby grand piano, usually alone, occasionally with the lights dimmed, and just play. Sometimes classical, sometimes jazz, sometimes improvisational meandering that matched the emotional chaos of the republic he was supposed to be running. He played like a man who didn't trust silence, but didn't want to be heard. And that's the contradiction, because Nixon was a man of secrets and a presidency of surveillance. The man who composed gentle melodies also created the tape system that recorded nearly everything said in the Oval Office. He didn't just install microphones, he expanded them. Meetings, phone calls, conversations that weren't supposed to matter. Why? Because he wanted a record. He wanted truth. He just didn't realize it might not belong to him. Nixon was always trying to outthink betrayal, outmaneuver enemies, outrun his own insecurities. He was brilliant, paranoid, oddly charismatic, and terminally defensive. He knew he wasn't lovable like Kennedy, not powerful like Johnson, not affable like Eisenhower. So he compensated with strategy, foreign policy, and weirdly soulful piano. He opened China, tamed inflation, briefly, won re-election in a landslide, and all the while the tapes were running, quietly, constantly. When Watergate cracked open, it wasn't a scandal. It was a Greek tragedy with microphones, because Nixon had taped the conspiracy himself. And when the Supreme Court ordered the release of those tapes, there they were, the voice, the plotting, the silences, the profanity, all of it. The same man who could play a nocturne with heartbreaking precision had also orchestrated his own collapse with breathtaking arrogance. When the dam finally broke, Nixon stood before the nation and delivered one of the strangest, most haunting presidential speeches in American history. Then he resigned, the first to ever do so. Not with fury, not with denial, but with a weird, almost serene melancholy. Before leaving, he reportedly sat at the piano one last time. No fanfare, no press. Just a few soft notes in the dark, as if he were trying to play himself off stage. He boarded the helicopter, lifted his arms in the infamous V for victory pose, smiled, flew away, and that was Nixon. A man who wanted to be known, but not watched. Who wanted to play beautiful things, but couldn't stop recording the silence between them. But if Nixon composed his downfall in secret, the next president, he did push-ups in his 60s, before meetings. He swam laps like treaties were hidden at the bottom of the pool. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford could still do push-ups in his 60s, real ones. Not the gently collapse onto a mat, while Secret Service pretends to cough kind. Full-on military-grade, arms to the floor push-ups, and he did them before meetings. Sometimes during breaks, once allegedly, while waiting for a congressional briefing on nuclear policy. Because Ford didn't govern from a throne. He governed like a high school wrestling coach who wandered into the Oval Office and refused to change out of his sweats. He swam laps daily, kept a strict workout routine, treated fitness like it was a form of national integrity. One aide said, "You could drop Ford into a gym anywhere in America, and no one would know he was president until he offered to spot them," which checks out. Because if Gerald Ford had a motto, it would have been, "Don't just lead, stretch first." But here's where it gets weird. Despite his athleticism, discipline, and literal balance, he kept falling. Stairs, ramps, runways. TV audiences were treated to Ford tripping more than policy briefings. It became a running gag. Late-night comedians roasted him. Chevy Chase made an entire career off impersonating Ford falling down things. But Ford never flinched. He laughed along. Even joked, "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln," which is devastatingly accurate and weirdly self-aware. And maybe that was his gift. Because Gerald Ford didn't ask to be president. He wasn't elected as vice president. He wasn't elected as president. He was the only person in U.S. history to hold both offices without winning a single national vote. He was installed by crisis. After Nixon resigned, the nation was in a tailspin. The Constitution was bent, bruised, and barely breathing. America didn't need charisma. It didn't need poetry. It needed someone who could walk in, do push-ups, and just not break anything. And that's what Ford did. He restored trust, stabilized the executive branch, offered transparency in an era still choking on Watergate residue. He even pardoned Nixon, a move so wildly unpopular it may have cost him the 1976 election, but one he believed was right. He said, "Our long national nightmare is over," and he meant it. He didn't swagger. He centered. He signed bills with clarity, not ego. He vetoed more legislation than most presidents, but with clean logic, not fury. And while he lacked glamour, he made up for it with this rare political trait, sincerity. He was an Eagle Scout, a Navy veteran, a college football star. He'd been offered contracts by the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers. He chose law school instead, because Gerald Ford wasn't trying to be famous. He was trying to be useful. And after losing to Jimmy Carter in 1976, Ford returned to private life with the same grounded approach. Exercise, books, speeches, golf. He aged with grace, dignity, and a killer forehand. In 2001, he became the longest-living U.S. president at the time. Quiet, steady, still showing up. A man remembered more for not breaking the country than for dazzling it. And maybe that's enough. Because while the world stumbled, Gerald Ford knew how to fall without staying down. But if Ford governed through sweat and stability, the next president, he once entered a peanut growing contest while in office, came in third, and then personally called the winner to congratulate him. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter once entered a peanut growing contest, not before he became president, while he was president, and he didn't win, didn't come in second either. Third place, but instead of sulking, spinning it, or calling it a fraud, Carter did what almost no one expected. He called the winner, personally, from the White House, to say, "Congratulations, you earned it." That's not just a phone call. That's a theology. Because Carter didn't govern like a politician, he governed like a moral parable wrapped in overalls. He was the first president since Thomas Jefferson to walk straight from a farm into the Oval Office. No war medals, no dynastic name, no cocktail circuit credentials, just soil under his nails and a quiet fury for justice. To understand Carter, you have to understand work, manual, honest, backbreaking. He believed work revealed character, that if you couldn't plant it, paint it, or fix it, maybe you didn't fully understand it. And he brought that worldview, raw, unpolished, and deeply inconvenient, right into the heart of Washington. He slashed the White House staff, canceled fancy dinners, turned down the thermostat, wore sweaters on national television, and begged Americans to conserve energy. He didn't want to perform presidency. He wanted to rebuild it, and America wasn't quite ready. His critics called him weak, pious, naive, but Carter wasn't naive. He was uncompromising. He brokered the Camp David Accords, one of the most significant peace treaties in modern Middle East history. He created the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, and pushed for human rights to be the new cornerstone of American foreign policy. He even put solar panels on the White House roof. Reagan would later take them down. But for all his clarity, Carter often felt like a man trying to run the country with a church bulletin and a wrench. The 1979 energy crisis, the hostage situation in Iran, inflation, a nation addicted to swagger, now faced with a president who refused to lie to them. He delivered what became known as the malaise speech, though he never used that word, urging Americans to confront a crisis of confidence. It was brilliant, introspective, painfully honest, and it tanked. Because Jimmy Carter didn't believe in spin. He believed in consequences, and that made him one of the most respected ex-presidents in American history, but a one-termer in the White House. After his loss to Reagan in 1980, Carter returned to Plains, Georgia, not to fade, but to build. He founded the Carter Center, monitoring elections around the world. He worked with Habitat for Humanity, hammer in hand. He wrote over 30 books. He taught Sunday school. He refused wealth. He lived humbly, and he never stopped working. He became a kind of living contradiction, the man once dismissed as soft, becoming the toughest moral compass in the post-presidential landscape. And that peanut growing contest, that wasn't a hobby. That was symbolic warfare, because even when he came in third, Jimmy Carter still showed up, made the call, and honored the winner, because he believed in effort over ego, in grace over victory, in growing things, not just governing them. But if Carter harvested humility, the next president, he took his naps very seriously. He even had a White House pillow embroidered with the words, "Don't wake me unless we're winning." Ronald Reagan had a pillow in the White House. Not just any pillow. It was embroidered, delicately, proudly, with the words, "Don't wake me unless we're winning." That wasn't just decoration. That was doctrine. Reagan believed in energy conservation, but not the environmental kind, his. He knew how to pace himself, how to rest, how to preserve his voice, his charm, his radiant smile, so that when the moment came, boom, he'd sparkle on cue. Because Reagan didn't govern like a bureaucrat. He governed like a daylight magician. He was the oldest man ever elected president at the time. But he made America feel young again. He didn't read 6 newspapers before breakfast like Kennedy. He didn't swim laps like Ford. He took naps, scheduled, prioritized, sacrosanct. And in those naps, the country somehow relaxed with him. Because Reagan didn't project stress, he projected confidence. Smiling, genial, stage-trained confidence, even when things were absolutely falling apart. Recession, smile, Challenger disaster, poetry, Iran-Contra scandal, shrug, forget, smile again. He once told a joke during a hot mic test. "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. It wasn't policy, it was timing. And in a way, it summed up the entire Reagan presidency. Because Ronald Reagan didn't just speak, he performed, flawlessly, repeatedly. And in that performance, America found something it hadn't felt since the war, mythology. He believed in America the way children believe in superheroes, not naively, but deliberately. He called it the shining city on a hill. He invoked it so often you'd think it had a zip code. He hated bureaucracy, despised red tape, but built one of the largest peacetime federal budgets in U.S. history. He slashed taxes, swore by trickle-down economics, ballooned the national debt, and still managed to be called a fiscal conservative with a straight face. Why? Because Reagan was coated in Teflon. Scandals slid off him. Facts bounced. Critics raged and ranted, and the public still liked him, even if they disagreed with him, even if he forgot a detail, even if he told the same joke 3 times. Because Reagan made people feel good, and in politics, feeling good often trumps thinking hard. But here's the twist. Behind the smile, the naps, the cowboy swagger, Reagan worried deeply about the Cold War, about nuclear annihilation, about whether the country he loved was fraying at the seams. He wrote letters in longhand, visited cemeteries alone, quoted scripture to himself. And when the Berlin Wall finally fell, years after his iconic "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall" speech, he didn't shout, didn't boast. He just smiled and took another nap, because Reagan knew performance is power, but so is pacing. And maybe that's what that pillow really meant. Not, "Don't wake me unless we're winning," in the military sense, but in the emotional sense. If we're not okay yet, let me sleep. Let me save the smile for when it counts. But if Reagan napped through crises and still won the applause, the next president, his handwriting told on him. It leaned right. It was filled with triple underlines, dashes, and "Hey pal" openings, because his pen had personality. George H.W. Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush had a very specific kind of handwriting. It leaned right, a subtle, forward-tilting script, like it was already moving into the future before the ink dried. It was full of triple underlines, dashes, circles, casual phrases, and almost every letter, no matter how formal, started with something like, "Hey pal, this wasn't lazy penmanship. This was a code, a handshake in ink, a hint that behind the protocol and diplomacy, the meetings and medals, the Gulf War and CIA files, there was a man who wanted to be known." Bush 41 wrote letters like he was trying to catch history off guard. He wrote to foreign leaders, to staff, to enemies, to janitors, to his sons, to strangers, to Bill Clinton, the man who beat him, offering grace with words smoother than any concession speech could manage. His notes weren't political. They were personal, urgent, tactile, like he feared something would be lost if he didn't write it down right now. And in a world that would soon become email-only, tweet-stained, and pixelated beyond repair, Bush was the last analog president. He trusted pens more than microphones. He didn't perform feelings. He mailed them, which is ironic because this man once ran the CIA. He knew how to hide things, how to encrypt, mask, delete. But when it came to his own thoughts, he couldn't stop scribbling, and maybe that's why his presidency felt so strange. Because George H.W. Bush was a master of resumes. Navy pilot, United Nations ambassador, congressman, envoy to China, Republican National Committee chair, CIA director, vice president, and finally, president. He was overqualified, perfectly seasoned, and yet always somehow underappreciated. He navigated the fall of the Soviet Union with subtlety and restraint, choosing calm over gloating. He led the world in the Gulf War, a military campaign so swift and decisive, it felt scripted. He passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, signed environmental protections, negotiated NAFTA, but he raised taxes, despite once famously saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And that single sentence, those 4 fatal words, became a trapdoor beneath his presidency. Because Bush wasn't slick, he wasn't loud, he didn't sell, he governed, and when the winds shifted, economic downturn, a charismatic challenger, a bored electorate, Bush lost re-election. He was stunned and gracious. After Clinton's inauguration, Bush left him a note in the Oval Office drawer. Not a dig, not a warning, just this: "Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you." Then he signed it, triple underline, leaning right. Hey pal, that's who he was. A man who flew combat missions in World War II, watched his plane catch fire and still made it back. A man who cried openly at speeches and laughed like an uncle trying not to spill his beer. A man who hugged world leaders and children the exact same way, awkwardly, completely. And after leaving office, he didn't plot a comeback. He went skydiving, he sent more letters, he made peace with history by handwriting his way through it. When he died in 2018, one of the tributes read, he never needed to be the loudest person in the room, because he'd already written everyone a note before they got there. But if Bush 41 wrote legacies in cursive, the next president, he remembered everything. Your name, your face, your childhood nickname. Even decades later, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had a near photographic memory. Not just for numbers, speeches, or stats, though he had those down too. He remembered names, faces, conversations, jokes, hometowns, dietary restrictions, and life details. Decades later, you'd run into him at a gas station in Des Moines in 1991 and say, "My cousin's name is Marvin, and he works in dairy." 15 years later, you'd be in an elevator with President Clinton, and he'd say, "How's Marvin doing with the cheese prices?" Like it was a thread you both agreed to keep tugging. It was eerie, it was charming, it was weaponized intimacy. Clinton didn't shake your hand. He entered your bloodstream. One journalist described meeting him as feeling like you were the only person in the world and also maybe slightly hypnotized. Even people who disliked him, liked him. It was a reflex. He'd look at you, nod slowly, and say your name like it was a shared secret. But the memory wasn't just party trick. It was political strategy. Clinton governed like a man trying to remember every American personally. He'd reference obscure county officials by name during speeches, mention regional problems that even locals forgot, pull stories from rope line conversations like he'd been taking notes in your heart, because Clinton didn't see crowds. He saw individuals, and that empathy, real or expertly mimicked, powered everything. He felt your pain, he said so, and somehow, even if nothing got fixed, you believed he was trying. But here's where it gets complicated. Clinton's memory wasn't limited to the good stuff. He remembered slights, grudges, every criticism from the press, every betrayal from allies. He could recite headlines like, "Old love letters written in acid," because behind the warmth was a mind always processing, always calculating, always filing things away for later. He was a Rhodes Scholar and a saxophone guy, a policy nerd who knew every clause in a bill, and still somehow found time to charm entire auditoriums off their feet. He was the ultimate both and president. He could recite Medicaid reform and your nephew's bar mitzvah date in the same sentence. He presided over a booming economy, tech explosion, welfare reform, a balanced budget, then got impeached for lying about sex. The contradiction? He was so good at connecting that people forgave him for nearly everything, and if you were angry, he'd sit with you. Really sit, lean in, tilt his head, say your name, tell a story, and you'd forget why you were mad. He left office with high approval. He made post-presidency cool. He started a global foundation, flew around the world, and shook more hands than a head of state and a bingo caller combined. Still remembering, still connecting, still storing you in that vast, unending Clinton Rolodex of emotional access points. Because for Bill Clinton, politics wasn't ideology. It was personal contact, stored, indexed, never deleted. But if Clinton remembered everyone else's details, the next president, he stared at a blank canvas one day and thought, "I can't sing, so I paint." George W. Bush. George W. Bush once said, "I can't sing, so I paint." And he meant it. No irony, no punchline, just a simple trade, sound for silence. After 8 years of war, scandal, and presidential punchlines, Bush didn't try to rewrite his legacy. He just picked up a brush and started painting. Dogs, landscapes, showers, world leaders, veterans. Not abstract, not avant-garde. Just raw, honest, sometimes awkward portraits, painted with a strange mix of restraint and vulnerability. You could feel the man trying, because that's the story of George W. Bush. Bush, a man who tried, sometimes too hard, sometimes too late, and sometimes without really knowing why. He was elected as the president you'd want to have a beer with. The guy from Texas, the son of a president, the walking smirk. But then, everything broke. The September event, 2 wars, Hurricane Katrina, the 2008 financial meltdown, and in the middle of it all, a man trying to speak clearly and often sounding like a man still figuring out where the subject of the sentence went. But Bush wasn't dumb. He was disarmed. Emotionally sincere, intellectually average, and shockingly decisive. He once said, "I'm the decider," and that was true. He made choices, often controversial, sometimes catastrophic, fast. The invasion of Iraq, the Patriot Act, tax cuts, torture memos, Guantanamo, mission accomplished. All of it. And through it, Bush never really wavered publicly. He was certain. And if he wasn't, he acted certain. Because that's what the job demanded, and what he believed America wanted. But after leaving office, he got quiet. No public counterpunches, no defensive memoir tour, just canvas, brushes, a little studio in Texas where the 43rd president of the United States painted stray dogs and Ukrainian presidents in oil. Badly at first, better with time, always with care. He painted wounded veterans he'd once sent into combat, met with them, listened, said little, let the brush speak. It's weirdly beautiful and morally disorienting, because the man who launched a war now paints the faces of the people it changed. One veteran said, "I don't know how I feel about him, but he paints me with dignity, and that counts." Another said, "It's like he's still trying to understand us." Exactly. Because Bush, for all his rhetoric, never quite seemed at home in politics. He wasn't a thinker, he was a feeler. And now in retirement, he finally found a language that didn't require a teleprompter or press conference or justification. Just paint. He doesn't exhibit much, doesn't sell, just gives the portraits away. to friends, to soldiers, to people he hurt. It's not redemption, but it's something human. Because George W. Bush may have failed to articulate the war, but he's trying, slowly, silently, to paint what it left behind. But if Bush painted because he couldn't sing, the next president, he dropped playlists like Policy, Beyonce, Kendrick, Springsteen, Coltrane, Fleetwood Mac, Barack Obama. Barack Obama's playlists weren't gimmicks. They were policy mood boards. They were how the 44th president of the United States let you know what he was thinking without saying it outright. And they were immaculate. Kendrick Lamar, Fleetwood Mac, Aretha Franklin, John Coltrane, Bruce Springsteen, Erykah Badu, Beyonce, and Billie Holiday, sitting side by side like cabinet members with perfect rhythm, each track carefully chosen, not to impress, but to align, to make you feel like the country wasn't unraveling, just shifting keys, because Obama didn't just communicate in speeches, he communicated in vibe. When he walked into a room, he brought a score. When he talked, it had cadence. He once said, "I'm LeBron, baby, I can play on this level," and it was true. His oratory had tempo, his pauses were syncopated, even his silences hummed like a vinyl crackle. But the playlists, those were personal diplomacy. He released summer and winter editions, date night soundtracks, workout jams, civil rights ballads, jazz for thinking, hip-hop for policy strategy. And through it all, you got the sense Obama didn't just want to be heard. He wanted to be felt. That's why people cried when he spoke. That's why crowds chanted not just, "Yes, we can," but "Yes, we feel it." Because Obama knew how to orchestrate emotion without being manipulative. He was cool, but never cold. Intellectual, but never condescending. He could quote Niebuhr and Nas in the same paragraph and somehow make it feel normal. But make no mistake, under that curated calm was a machine. He was deliberate, sharp. His campaign was the most data-driven in history. He weaponized the internet like Reagan weaponized the camera. And still, he wasn't perfect. He promised post-partisanship. What he got was Mitch McConnell. He wanted to close Gitmo. He got gridlock. He presided over drone strikes, mass surveillance, and the quiet erosion of transparency. He built a healthcare law so complex, even its own defenders couldn't fully explain it. He was a constitutional scholar who left some corners of the Constitution a little scorched. And yet, he never lost tempo. Even when the hope started to crack. Even when the "yes, we can" turned into "maybe we can't right now." Even when the system he tried to reform refused to be reformed. He kept spinning the track. Kept laying down new beats. Because Obama wasn't trying to conduct a revolution. He was trying to write a remix. His farewell speech, a masterclass. Rising strings, calm rhythm, ending on a soft, subtle crescendo. Yes, we can. Yes, we did. Yes, we can. And the country, divided, exhausted, overstimulated, nodded. Because even if the lyrics hurt, the melody still moved. He left office with Spotify followers, a memoir in 3 acts, a podcast with Bruce Springsteen, and a personal playlist that still drops every summer. Not as nostalgia, as a reminder, this was how he led. With tone, with taste, with enough bass to ground the policy, and enough soul to carry the doubt. But if Obama led with playlists and poetry, the next president, he tweeted loudly, while watching TV in bed at 3 a.m., and usually after 4 hours of sleep, Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump slept about 4 hours a night. That's not a guess. That's a documented habit. He'd go to bed late, usually with the TV still on, and start tweeting by dawn, often before most of his staff had even had coffee or therapy. It wasn't unusual to see a 3:47 a.m. tweet that read, "Sad," or "Fake news," or "I built a great company." Tremendous company, everybody knows it, as if governing a nuclear superpower was just an ongoing, very aggressive Yelp review. But here's the thing, Trump wasn't just tweeting. He was broadcasting. Not policy, not platforms, but himself, live, 24/7, unedited, unfiltered, unpredictable. He was the first president to treat the job like his own reality show. Because for Trump, the presidency wasn't a role he assumed. It was a brand extension. And the White House? The new set. He never fully moved in, physically or emotionally. He slept in a separate room, kept his old habits, watched hours of cable news, sometimes more than he read briefings. He'd tweet during interviews, correct live segments with his own version of events, retweet fans, block critics, start feuds with senators, comedians, athletes, and foreign leaders, often in the same hour. And it worked, because Trump understood one thing better than almost anyone. The modern presidency isn't just about power, it's about attention, and he was a gravitational singularity of it. Good press, bad press, didn't matter. If the camera was pointed at him, he was winning. He reshaped the Republican Party in his image. Louder, angrier, more nationalist. He blew up norms, tore up talking points, refused to apologize, to retreat, to explain. He governed on instinct, not principle. Tax cuts, trade wars, executive orders like bullet points in a boardroom pitch. And all the while, the phone stayed in his hand, ready to fire off one more tweet, one more insult, one more stream of consciousness press release in 280 characters or less. But behind the volume, the spectacle, the Trump Force One banners and MAGA hats was something else. A man who never truly believed in governing. He believed in winning, in ratings, in dominating the frame. He said things like, "I alone can fix it, and nobody knows more about insert topic here than me." And sometimes it felt like he was parodying The Office in real time. Only he wasn't, because Trump didn't see contradiction. He saw momentum, and the job to him was to stay on top of the feed. But the cost? A nation spinning in permanent outrage. A pandemic fumbled, an economy in freefall, an election denied, and a violent mob on January 6th, 2021 trying to retweet the Republic in real time. He was impeached. Twice. Acquitted. Twice. And somehow still remained the most electrifying, exhausting political figure in modern American history. When he finally left office, the platforms turned off. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, silenced. It was like the show had been canceled in mid-episode. No finale. Just static. Joe Biden. Joe Biden eats ice cream almost every day, not just on weekends, not just at campaign stops, at briefings, after debates, on rope lines, cone in hand, smiling, nodding. Sometimes mid-policy quote, it became his most reliable accessory, like FDR's cigarette holder or Reagan's naps, a soft-serve symbol of comfort, normalcy, and repetition. Staffers didn't even flinch anymore. If a crisis briefing ran late, someone made sure there was a freezer nearby. It's a small thing, but for Biden, small things matter. He came into office at 78, the oldest president ever elected, carrying a political career longer than most voters' lifespans. He'd been a senator since Nixon, a vice president under Obama, and suddenly, back again, inheriting a country mid-pandemic, post-insurrection, and profoundly exhausted. His pitch wasn't revolution, it was relief, return, a kind of institutional muscle memory. The strategy? Steady the ship. Don't capsize the narrative. Wear the aviators. Whisper the speech. Finish the cone. And for a while, it worked. The vaccine rollout accelerated. The economy jolted awake. Big sweeping bills passed. Infrastructure, climate funding, expanded child tax credits. He even signed executive orders like someone crossing off chores with quiet urgency. But public perception never quite caught up. Critics called him slow, out of touch, overly cautious. Supporters called him deliberate, grounded, focused. In truth, both views held weight. His speeches often meandered. His age became a constant undercurrent. He was prone to folksy tangents, whispered punchlines, and stories that began 3 sentences before anyone realized they'd started. Opponents painted him as a relic. Allies said he was a bridge. And Biden? He kept talking about Scranton, about working class pride, about unity, often while governing in a time when unity felt like a retro slogan. He exited Afghanistan, a decision praised by some, condemned by others, executed messily. He responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with international coalition building and a cautious show of strength. He spent much of his presidency walking the tightrope between restoration and reinvention, sometimes managing both, sometimes neither, and always ice cream. When asked what his favorite flavor was, he said, chocolate chip. Simple, specific, memorized. Maybe that's the metaphor. A presidency not built on sweeping rhetoric or dramatic transformation, but on habit, familiarity, the daily scoop, and in a political era fueled by performance, spectacle, and volatility, Biden's version of leadership was slower, quieter, often uncertain, but still moving forward, one cone at a time.